We far surpass our peer institutions in terms of women student enrollment and women faculty. The latest numbers I saw is that we hover around 40% in both of those areas, whereas our peer institutions hover around between 5 and 7% of their overall enrollment. So this really is a unique place, and we celebrate its uniqueness even as we lament its uniqueness in some sense. We also would like to welcome those who are joining us by live stream, whether they're joining us in this moment or in the recording in days to come. So our audience is larger than what we see around the room, but the audience here is also splendid. Thank you for being here. The Women's Studies in Religion academic certificate is a doable process. So if you are not already enrolled in the Women's Studies in Religion academic certificate program, we do invite you to explore that possibility. Our website is located at gtu.edu/WSR, and it lists the requirements there. We are also in the process of inviting folks to serve on the steering committee next year. So if that is something that is of interest to you, we have both faculty and students who serve on that steering committee. It gives you an opportunity to help shape the programming that we do every year, and also provides a wonderful opportunity for networking and creating meaningful relationships among students, both students and faculty, with similar interests here at the GTU. If that is of interest to you, I invite you to talk with me or with Sheryl Johnson, who is our program coordinator, or with any of our other current steering committee members. I invite you to raise your hand so you can be identified. So feel free to speak with any of us about that. I would like to lift up a special word of gratitude to Sheryl Johnson, our program coordinator, who does a tremendous amount of work throughout the year, keeping this program running, and really provided much of the logistics, all of the logistics for making this event possible. So thank you so much. So without further ado, I please welcome our presider for this morning's event.
Good morning. I'd like to echo Professor Davidson's welcome to all of you this morning, and also introduce myself. My name is Jen Owens-Hofre, and I am a doctoral candidate here at the GTU in interdisciplinary studies. I'm working on my dissertation right now, which looks at devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe in terms of its implications for Mariology and for ministry. And as much as I would love to talk more about that today, I won't. Instead, I'd like to invite forward our three panelists who will be speaking about their own research, and I'll introduce each of you first. So if Laura Dunn would be, is welcome to join us, as well as Mahjabeen Dhala and Hanna Kang, you're welcome to come forward and take a seat. Laura Dunn is a second-year doctoral student at the GTU who focuses on the fierce emanations of Sakti in the goddess traditions of Hinduism. In addition to studying the rituals, material culture, and literature affiliated with the rich goddess theologies of South Asia, Laura works to find the relevance and meaning of traditional Indian spirituality in modernity, and how yoga, tantra, and devotional practices have been reimagined and reinterpreted in late and post-modernity in the United States and Asia. Mahjabeen Dhala completed her MA with honors here at the GTU and is continuing as a presidential scholar in the PhD program in the Department of Sacred Texts and their interpretation. Her dissertation looks at the Sermon of Fatima to trace early Shia activist voices, especially those of women. In her capacity as a religious speaker and a spiritual guide, she has traveled widely, thus gaining a unique insight into the concerns of Muslim women, both in the global north and the global south. Lastly, Hanna Kang is a first-year doctoral student at the GTU in Cultural and Historical Studies. Her advisor is Jerome Baggett. Please welcome our panelists. And just a brief word about procedure. Each panelist will present in the order in which I've introduced them. I have a few little signs to remind them of the time as they go. Each will speak for about 20 minutes. And at the end of all three presentations, we'll open it up for about 30 minutes of Q&A. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Right, so the title of my presentation this morning is Yogini-s in the Flesh, Power, Praxis, and the Embodied Divine Feminine. I rely on images a lot throughout this presentation to sort of talk about how cultural symbols are disseminated and reinterpreted and understood. And I feel like this first image here needs a little bit of clarification. So this is an image of a yogini named Mingyur Yogini, and she's a Deshanling nun of Nepal. This presentation is not about yoginis in Nepal. It's about South Asian yoginis. But if you go to Google and you type in yoginis and India, you really don't get a lot of information, which I think is significant about, like, you know, the kinds of images and the kinds of symbols that we have in our consciousness about what that word means. And I also like that she kind of like subverts like popular Western conceptions of a yogini. The yoginis that I am going to talk about today are going to be Karaikal Ammayar, which means the mother of Ammayar, or the mother of Karaikal, excuse me, and Radhagiri. Ammayar is from the 6th century in Tamil Nadu, and Radhagiri is from the 20th century. She might have passed by now, from Haridwar. And using a polythetic mode of classification, which I will discuss, I think, in the next slide, I'm going to illustrate first how female spiritual agency, otherwise understood as Shakti, is variously constructed in relationship to each of these women's particular social realities. Second, I'll illustrate how their Shakti is expressed and asserted through the performance of sadhana. And third, I illustrate how their self-construction as yogini lends to the transgression of old categories of female spiritual agency. And particularly in that third point, what I hope to bring out is how these women are appropriating notions of gender for their own purposes. Okay, so what is a polythetic mode classification? I don't want to get too heavy in theory, so I'm going to try to go over this pretty quickly. Polythetic mode classification, according to Saquile in his work on yoginis, is membership in a class which is going to be determined by possession of significant shared properties, no single one which is held by all members of a class. And this sort of rejects the monothetic essentialist idea of a perfect, unique, single differentia. If you're familiar with Wittgenstein, this is drawing off of his notion of family resemblances. And this word cloud here is sort of like late breaking on my PowerPoint. So it's sort of like, I kind of like did like a little fast and loose exercise with primary and secondary sources here. But I think it really illustrates exactly what a polythetic mode of classification is. I took the Yoni Tantra, the Yogini Tantra, and I think the Kalika Purana, a couple of other primary sources. And then I took some secondary sources on yoginis by David Gordon White, Miranda Shaw, and I believe Judith Summer Brown. I made copies and I highlight words that came up, right? So descriptive words, adjectives, things that the goddess does, or the yogini does, and things that the yogini manifests as. Sometimes she manifests as animals. And so I just plugged all these words in, and you guys all know how word clouds work, I hope. And the words that are the biggest, right, are the ones that show up the most frequently. The ones that are the smallest show up the least frequently. Surprising, blood comes up first. And this largely has to do with the tantric rituals involving blood, but also women's menstrual blood, so which is interesting to see. What I do think is important about this is that if you go to some of, like, especially contemporary Western scholarship on the yogini, it really brings out her sexual aspects, her sexual fluids, her yoni or her vagina. It's really sort of like a scintillating kind of experience to read some of these secondary source materials. But if you go actually straight to the text and you start reviewing what kinds of things are coming up most frequently, you see things like magical, power, beautiful, liberation. Sexual does show up, but it doesn't show up any more than anything else. So I think that when we're thinking about polythetic modes of classification, this is a really good example why we can't just go and scratch the surface of what a yogini is according to certain people whose focus is on very certain types of qualities or categories. The methodology I chosen to use, is a comparative method. And what I'm going to do is compare historical text alongside these women's own self-assertion or their own self-narratives, which is usually going to be illustrated in their what is called sadhana, or their personal spiritual practice. So first in Amayard, we're looking at a hagiography by a man named Saquile that was authored in the 12th century. And like I said earlier, she's 6th century, so we have 600 years of space and time between her and her story. And then her own self-revelation as expressed in her bhakti poetry to Shiva. Second, I compare the conceptions of the yogini in the popular imagination, which are largely drawn from those texts that I talked about just a second ago, against her own, what she calls her kriya and karma yoga sadhana, or so her practice of right actions with her community. And to bring out how sadhana or how ritual acts are functioning for these women, I've chosen to use two different kinds of ritual theory and try to meld them together a little bit to illustrate my point. So first, very briefly, is just Edmund Leach. And what he is attempting to do is orient social behavior through linguistics and cultural symbols. And I believe that one of those symbols is going to be gender. He also believes that ritual is modifying the social order through appropriation of its categories, again, gender, and enables the transgression of these categories. What is significant about Leach is that he understands the individual not to be like a passive subject of society, like where society is just sort of like molding us and we have no control over it. What he's saying is that through the act of ritual, we are actively recreating and reconstructing ourselves and society, which I think is really important when we're looking at how like women are operating in the religious and spiritual sphere, how they act as agents. Second is Catherine Bell, and she uses performance theory to talk about ritual. And this performance theory has 4 different components. First of all, it's interpretive and it affects changes in perception, both of the actor and of the audience. Second, meaning is rendered within a frame that recontextualizes action so that it alters the meaning of that action. In other words, when something happens within a frame, it means something differently than if it were to occur outside of that frame. And third, ritual is deemed such due to its perceived efficacy, which demarcates it from basic communication or just like simple entertainment. And finally, it provides an opportunity for reflexivity by the actors, who through the ritual performance are capable of reflection upon their actions and their identity. And I think this also has implications for researchers as well. It sort of like builds upon this whole like process of reflexivity. Okay, so just like the word cloud indicated how many different kinds of conceptions of yoginis there are. I use, like I said, I use images a lot because images, again, if I type in yogini with different kinds of like other search terms, I get a lot of different things on the internet. And so you can see the multivalence of the term here. On the top right, we have some Tibetan Yogini-s, and they are called Yogini-s, the dancing Yogini-s of Tibet. Down here on the lower right-hand side, they're the Dashanami Nata Yogini-s of India, and this is at the Kumbh Mela, a huge festival. And they also like to dance. So that is one thing about Yogini-s that I find consistent, is that they're always dancing. Lower left, contemporary Yogini, in a very contemplative position, sitting in Padmasana or the lotus. And then up top is another Nepalese Yogini named Jomo, and in the middle, some of you might recognize Anandamayi Ima, the famous tantric Yogini. So this is a gallery of images that I procured from museum websites from Europe and the United States. And I chose to bring these images into play just to talk about what is salient for the West. Why are these images of the Yoginis being shown? And so as you look through the previous slides and also these slides here, you kind of what I would like is for us to think about some of those words that had come up in that word cloud. And this is from a temple in Hirapur, the 64 Yoginis, not in a museum, but on a museum website. Same here. Notice they're all very full-breasted, and they adhere to kind of a standard ideal form of feminine beauty, which is not a bad thing. Again. And this one is from San Antonio Museum of Art. And here we see indications of transgression. She's riding on a vahan or an animal vehicle, and she's got different weapons. She's got her fingers in her mouth, and I don't know why. Just trying to figure that out. She's got 4 arms. And here's another one. And this is from the V&A in London. And this one here, I like this one just because I feel like it's such an amalgamation of a lot of those words, right? She's got an animal head. One of the small words on that was horse and jackal, right? So one of her manifestations. A sense of the mother is here, is that she's carrying a small child. And finally, from the Saquile gallery, here's another Yogini, which reminds me of the picture of the Western Yogini in the beginning. But so you start to get a sense of what we're connecting with as a culture. Okay, so Carceral Amayar. So her hagiography, I'll start with Saquile's hagiography. I'm going to go through it really fast. Written in the 12th century, and it talks about her in terms of what is normative and conventional for that time frame for women. She's a devoted wife. She's apparently very beautiful, and she's married to a wealthy merchant. One day, while she's making lunch or preparing lunch, she's got these 2 mangoes that they were given for his lunch. A sadhu comes to the door and is begging for food, and it's always bad luck to turn away a sadhu when he's begging for food. So she gives him one of the mangoes in the hope that the husband will not be that hungry and he won't ask for the second mango. Of course, you know what's coming, right? He asks for the second mango after eating the first one because it's so delicious. And apparently this is really gets her unhinged. And so she runs back into the kitchen and she does her sadhana to Shiva. You can see the Shiva Linga, the anaponic form of Shiva in the top right, begging for help. And so from the power of her bhakti, her devotion, her sadhana, miraculously Shiva delivers this second mango. So she goes out and gives her husband the second mango. And it's 1,000 times more amazing than that first mango. It's sweeter, it's juicier. And he asks, so wait a second, where's the second mango from? I mean, these people are really about their mangoes. So much for taking things at face value. And so she tries to tell him, Shiva gave it to me, and he doesn't believe her. And so she drags him back into the kitchen and performs her sadhana once again. And once again, a mango appears. He is so terribly afraid at the display of her Shakti, of her power, that he runs away from her and the marriage for several years. And yeah, I know, right? And because she's such a devoted wife, she carries on living as a wife, taking care of their home as if he were still there in that time period. Her parents at some point find him and say, hey, we found your man, you better come check it out. And so she goes to him, and in this lower left-hand corner, you see the image of what she finds. She finds that he is taken up with another woman, and that they have had a child. Pravina's looking very upset right now. And that I love this part of the story. I'm like, wow, this Checklar guy, he's really like getting in there. The child he names after Amayar, right? And so she is just completely distraught, runs away. And again, who does she go to for solace? She goes to Shiva. And she says, take away from me my beauty, take away from me this worldly life. And the lower right-hand image here, you can see what happens to her. She's transformed into what she terms in her poetry is the demon of correct call. However, her own poetry tells a not very different, but a significantly different story. Different enough that it's worth talking about the differences. Her poetry never speaks about her life prior to her devotion for Shiva. All right, I'll rush through. You can read this here. She calls herself a female bull with withered breasts, bulging veins, hollow eyes, etc., shriveled stomach, that she stays in the cemetery, howling angrily. These are references to tantric sadhana, right? You do your sadhana or your meditation, your contemplation in the cemetery. She says that this is the place where my Lord dances in the fire with a cool body. She speaks of Shiva here, the one who has kept another eye on his forehead has made me understand a little of him. I am one of the ghouls among his good ganas, his good followers. So differentiating between left hand and right hand tantra. Whether or not his grace lasts, I do not want anything else. By speaking of this garland of verses, the words uttered, here she proclaims herself the demon of Karaikal, who is melting with love. Those who worship with unending love will reach Shiva and worship him with great love. So as I said before, in her poetry, which is ample, she never speaks about a married life. She never speaks about being away. She never speaks about being beautiful. So in fact, we have very little information about who she was prior to this time. So Saquile writes from a very 12th century perspective for a 12th century audience. In the 6th century, something that scholars have uncovered is that her poems might have been formative in the foundation of what is now understood as the Shaiva Siddhanta movement. So in fact, she was a leader of this movement, which is now a major tradition in Tamil Nadu, and was so at the 12th century. The rituals described in the poems starkly contrast the religious rituals and forms found in Buddhism and Jainism, both of which were in competition with Shaivism at the time. So this movement in Tamil Nadu aimed to undercut caste and gender hierarchies, but did so within the context of the temple. So we might read some of her poems as a metaphoric way to push back against some of the rituals that were going on in these other religious traditions. She is also significant in that other women bhaktas who come up later, like Mirabai, for example, who relate to the divine as lover and beloved. She is very much devotee to Lord. So there's no romantic love at all in her poems. Am I running out of time?
You have about 2 minutes.
Okay, all right. So Radhagiri, really quickly. 20th century yogini in Haridwar, which is right by the Ganga. And all of the information about her was procured by ethnographies from 2 scholars who each spent about 7 to 10 years in the region studying what they call sadhvi, or a female renunciate, and yoginis. So she's talked about as being fiercely independent, and she's rumored to have magical powers, or was rumored to have magical powers. At the time of her first ethnography that was done on her, she was 93 years old, and she had been living by the Ganga in a little encampment for about 25 years. She's known for her fierce temper, and many have regarded her as a witch. However, those that follow her and venerate her admire and respect her. Okay, so her daily sadhana is informed by devotion, and it revolves around the care of her community and her physical encampment in Haridwar. So her choice to remain in one location is already starting to subvert what is considered to be normative for sadhus and yogis. So they tend to move around a lot. And she has chosen to stay in one place, which some people suspect might have something to do with the fact that she's a woman. It's not as safe for her to be moving around. Okay? And so the fact that she is stable, or she's what they call sedentary, starts to influence the manner in which she enacts her sadhana. So she starts to build relationships with these people that she lives among. She cares for a mad woman by feeding her and protecting her from harm. She feeds and cares for stray dogs to the extent that they live with her in her home. And this is so like, I don't know, it's like almost like cliche. She finds a girl baby in a basket in the river, who she takes and raises as her own, which caused apparently a lot of controversy for law enforcement in the area. What is significant is that this Shakti that she believes she gets from her bhajan or her practice is all from the power of God, and that is time. So I will leave you with just a couple of things here. You can see the two columns here are comparing popular conception and how she's appropriated those conceptions to her own aims to give not only herself, but the people who venerate her a sense of empowerment and liberation in their circumstances. And again, just a comparative list of different notions of women yoginis in text and in history as compared to how it is lived out in actual sadhana or in practice. Thanks very much.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to see you all this morning. As you can see, my talk is going to be from a female Muslim perspective, and the title is 5 Foundational Women in the Qur'an, and proposing a rereading of their stories from the Shia female perspective. Now, my aim for going into this study, and especially picking these 5 women, is because they're very popular throughout the Abrahamic traditions, and it's going to be easier for me to just go to my conclusions from their narratives instead of just reading out their narratives to you. So I went into this study primarily to argue that Muslim women seek their agency and their role as human actors from their sacred text itself. The text is enabling women, authorizing women, and even inspiring women to create change and bring about social justice. So where does the oppression lie then for the Muslim woman? It lies majorly in the patriarchal interpretation of that text. And I make a case here based on the readings of Asma Barlas and Amina Wujud and Barbara Stowasser, that for a large part of those interpretations being patriarchal is because of the heavy borrowing from the biblical traditions by the early exegetes. And they've made this whole case in their books, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with their work. One last point that I make in this study is that the Shia narrative is very marginalized, and it is the minority within the minority, and the literature doesn't really see the light of day, is less referenced, less cited, and I propose with this presentation to bring to you the fresh take that it gives on these narratives, and also a liberatory aspect in their stories, and perhaps to facilitate an understanding why modern Muslim women then choose piety and choose to live with piety and visible Muslim appearance in liberal countries and societies here in the West. So without further ado, I have this gadget here. I'm going to go to the first woman who I've chosen, and that can be nonetheless, it all starts with Eve. So it all starts with her, the mother of humankind, and of course the two notoriously infamous stereotypical characteristics that emerge from her story, and women are trying to wash that off till today. One is the common assertion that she was created from the rib of Adam, and somehow leading to being a second-class citizen, or just not able to do what a man can do. And secondly, the scandalous reputation that she is the one who started this, the initial sin. Yeah. Now, you're very familiar with it. What I'm trying to do is tell you that the creation of the Adam, creation from the rib of Adam is not sustained in the Qur'an anywhere. There is no single verse in the Qur'an that alludes to that. Nor is there any verse in the Qur'an that says Eve misled Adam and then they were taken out of their paradise where they were living in peace. I want to really share with you this one narrative from a Shia book, which was written by Sheikh Saduq, and it's a long name. And he talks about the creation of Eve. And this might be a fresher take on what you might have already heard about that narrative. So when people came to the sixth Imam of the Shiite 12 Imams following, his name is Ja'far, and they came and they said, people are talking about Eve being created from the rib of Adam, and what is your take on this theology, or on this theory? And he said, that's a crazy theory, because what are you trying to say? That was God not able to create another creature? Or that Adam married his own body part? Is that what you're trying to say? So then he gives this narrative. He says, God the Most High created Adam from clay, and then he created Eve and placed her beside him. Adam asked her, who are you? She replied, a creation created by God, as you can see. Duh. Then Adam said, oh Lord, what a beautiful creation is this? Looking at her makes me yearn for her company, of course. God said, oh Adam, this is my servant Eve. Would you like to be with her? Would you like her to accompany you, talk to you, share your affairs? And he says, oh yes, my Lord. I would praise you and be thankful to you as long as I remain. And then God married them. So Adam called her, come to me. She said, no, you come to me. And Adam had to rise and move towards her. I find this a better narrative. This second part, which I'm going to say in context to that contemptuous theory, that she's the one, the root of all problem, the initial sin. Like I said, there is no verse in the Quran that would sustain that theory, but I found this prayer. Now this prayer itself is called the prayer of Dawood. So that's a prayer named after a woman. And this woman is someone whose son was confiscated or taken away by the government, the Abbasid Caliph, and she came to the sixth Imam and she said, they're going to kill him because he's a Shia. So he said, sit down, do some prayers, and recite this prayer. I'm talking about this prayer because this is recited annually in all Shia communities every year. They do it. In fact, they did it 2 weeks back in my community where I go to in San Jose. So it's become part of their rhetoric. That's how they pray to their Lord once a year using this prayer. And in this prayer, this caption about Eve is so refreshing. It's so liberatory. It is not at all like the satanic temptress that she's made out to be. Look at this part. She's used as an intercessor for this prayer. O God, send blessings upon our mother Eve, the one purified from every filth, the one cleansed from every dirt, the one favored among humankind. In fact, the Arabic word is also ins, as in humankind, the frequently present among the stations of sanctity, So you see the four things here: the nobility as a mother, her pureness, cleansed from every kind of filth and dirt, her supremacy, she's preferred over all humankind, and of course her spiritual elevation, because she's so sacred, and because of her sanctity we use her as an intercessor in our prayers. So this gives us a very different picture of what she's made out to be. The second woman that I talked about, and I'm not going to go too much into this part because this is Hajar, as we call her in Arabic, or Hagar, as you may know her, and she is the pioneer of this important fundamental tenet of Islam, and that is the Hajj. And she's the one who established it, and all women and men who go for Hajj actually embody and emulate her actions. So she is the woman who is followed in this very important and intrinsic part of worship in Islam. Now, although there is no direct reference to her in the Qur'an, and most of her narrative is based or built around tradition, this verse in the Qur'an actually talks about her or alludes to her, because she is left into the desert with her infant child. Now, you know the story. I'm going to tell you what the story is not. It is not about female rivalry in a patriarchal home. It's not about that. Although it's very convenient to talk about her like that. And I'll tell you what it's not. It's not validation for men to run away from their spousal duties saying, Abraham did it. It's not about that. So the narrative is not about that. What is it about then? It is about God using a woman as her agent to establish the house that is going to be the direction toward which every faithful person is going to turn to in prayer. She's going to be the one who embodies the actions that every faithful will go and enact in her name. And if they don't do it once in a lifetime, then they will be falling short or missing in their duty as faithful believers. So that has her importance. To just very, very quickly summarize, I love this quote from Shariati. Ali Shariati, in his book Fatima is Fatima, has written this, and he's given this beautiful tribute to Hajar. He said, the God of Abraham chooses a woman from among this great humanity, or human society, as his unknown soldier, a mother and a slave. In other words, God chose a creature who in all systems of humanity lacks nobility and honor. God orders Abraham to build the greatest house of worship for humanity, and alongside it, the grave of this woman. I don't know how many Muslims even realize it, that when they go for Hajj, they're actually circumambulating around the tomb of a woman. I don't even know if they realize that. These three women, I must talk about them, and I'll say within my time. The mother of Moses, you know the story. These are the verses in the Quran. She lives during the time of a tyrant who is killing infants, is slicing the stomachs of women so that he can get rid of this child who is afraid of. In that time, when she gives birth to a child, she hears a voice in her head saying, nurse him, put him in a box, throw him in the river. What is it called? The baby blues? Yes. These depressive thoughts that you have in your mind? Now, what does it take for a woman at her time? I mean, if you could just put yourself into her shoes for that part of the narrative. She hears this voice in her head. Nurse the baby, put him in a box, throw him in the river. First, this points out that God speaks to her. As a woman, she is qualified to receive revelation. Secondly, she is intellectually strong enough to discern the sound of the divine from a depressive thought. And thirdly, she doesn't passively rely just on God, she has an action as well. She tells the sister, follow that box. Follow that box. This I find very ingenious about her. The sister of Moses. So what did she do? She started following the box. Now, you know the story. But what I'd like to highlight here in the role of the sister, which just goes in the periphery somewhere, because there are no direct verses in the Quran about her contribution. But when I think about her, I don't know how old she was. So I don't know if she's a teenager, I don't know if she's a young adult, but I know she's a woman. And she is running after a casket or a box which is flowing in the river, but she is on foot. And I don't know what terrain she is running against. So this is talking about her physical stamina. So don't call women physically weak. This is her physical stamina, and she's running behind this box. Secondly, she infiltrates the Pharaoh's palace, and that's not something easy to do. She finds herself in a decision-making scene where they're wondering, what are we going to do with this baby? And she has the courage to say, I know what you can do. I know someone who can nurse this child. To me, all that takes a lot of courage. I mean, nothing less than a mission impossible. To infiltrate in there and then speak and rescue Moses and sort of unite him with his mother, become God's agent. God says, throw him into the water, I will make sure that I reunite you with your son again, and she becomes that agent who enacts God's plan. And of course, lastly, for this presentation, is the wife of the Pharaoh. And I couldn't talk, I mean, I could just go on about her, but I know when to stop. One of the beautiful things about her in the Quran is that she is presented as a role model for humankind, women and men, not just a role model for men. Allah draws an example for those who have faith, the wife of the Pharaoh, when she said, my Lord, build me a home near you in paradise and deliver me from the Pharaoh and his conduct and deliver me from the wrongdoing lot. What is this saying about the wife of the Pharaoh? She's the one who intervenes and protects the child who is the infant Moses. Very quickly from this verse you can find out that she is not a material person, even though she's married to the richest trump of her time. She yearns the proximity of God. She wants a house in God's proximity. Speaks a lot to her spirituality. She exonerates herself from the actions of her spouse. She may be physically espoused with him, but through her conduct she is divorced from what he does or chooses to do. And not only that, she denounces injustice everywhere, the wrongdoing lot. And then you know how the story goes, that when he wants to kill this child, the Pharaoh, she intervenes and she says two things here, which I want to bring out. And I argue that this is not just a woman, a disturbed woman with a desperate plea. No, this is a well-articulated proposal. Because simple emotional ramblings wouldn't go far with Pharaoh, because he's killed so many women and he's killed so many children that he's immune to that now. So her proposal had to be brave and it had to be well articulated. There had to be something in there for him. Now Barbara Stowasser talks about the impotency of the Pharaoh. So she doesn't have a lot of spousal pleasure there, and the chances of him not having an heir. So when she puts her proposal, she said, maybe this child could be a comfort to you and me because you're not making me happy. And secondly, you're not going to have an heir. Perhaps we could take him as a son. He could serve that purpose to us too. And I think it was this well-articulation of her proposal that allowed Moses to live in the house of the very tyrant who had promised to kill him. So she becomes instrumental here. So these are the women that I chose to speak about. And very quickly I'm just going to conclude with some of the points that I'm trying to make through this study. Of course it was, as you can see, a feminist hermeneutical approach to the Quran from the perspective of women. But what I'm really trying to make here is a case for religious women, Muslim women, reading the foundational sources normatively. This is the case I'm trying to make here. And that is quite against the biblical hermeneutics. And this relates to the first point, is a critique of the Western feminism's secular bias and the abandonment of religion. So the Muslim feminist is not sharing that same insight. Now, this is where I'm going to talk about my position in this whole thing, and that's the last thing that I'm going to bother you with. Now, Islam is a complex tradition. Sunni and Shia, which is a minority within the minority, and it gets reduced to sound bites for mixed audiences due to political, in the political context. And as a scholar myself, I see the labor of Muslim women's scholarship goes unnoticed, being dismissed as not sufficiently critical of their own religion. And not sufficiently critical of their own patriarchy. But it misses our scholarly work in narrative poetics, in theory, in methodology, and all we are supposed to do is talk about politics and how we are fighting patriarchy rather than being assessed on our academic contributions. I would really like to see more Shia literature coming to light, being cited in academic work, and more of the scholarship being shared across traditions. So thank you so much for your time, and yeah, it was a pleasure. I'll be happy to take questions if you have.
So my presentation is called Marian Veneration, its origin and implication on gender roles in the Latin America. I'm going to read the abstract. So this paper explores how religious practices are reinterpreted and readapted as they are introduced to a new culture, and shows how people use their religious devotions as a tool to understand certain aspects of reality. Therefore, this paper claims that the belief and practices of Marian veneration in Latin America, which was originally implemented by the Spanish colonizers, had later been conflated with the worship of local female deities. Also explores how Marian devotion affects people's worldview today, especially when they deal with machismo, a form of sexism that is still strongly sensed in many parts of the continent. So, growing up as a Protestant in a relatively conservative and evangelical Presbyterian church in Argentina, I remember that since I was little, I was taught that we should be careful not to give too much attention to the person and role of Mary. Rather, I was taught that Mary should be considered a faithful follower of God, like many other great men and women in the Bible, through whom God decided to show the mystery of incarnation. So on one hand, such a strong feeling of alertness on the part of most evangelical Protestants against Mariology is closely related to their experiences in everyday life, at least in Argentina. In fact, living in a country like Argentina, where Catholicism has long been the most influential religion, it is easy to find statues of Mary in any public parks and squares wherever there was a Catholic church nearby. So this is a park public park in Buenos Aires, and you can see the statue of Mary. People touched her, blessed her, kissed her, bowed in front of her, and gave her flowers. But there was no Jesus, or he was there, but as a defenseless baby in the arms of Mary. So people seem to feel more connected to the Virgin than to Jesus. But on the other hand, whenever I asked my Catholic friends about the role of Mary in their religious lives, their answer was very clear. They said they did not worship Mary, but they venerated her. Nevertheless, I think it was very easy to tell that Mary had a very special position in their religious lives. For example, here in Argentina, The Basilica of Lady of Luján in Buenos Aires is one of the most representative and famous cathedrals in Argentina dedicated to the Virgin, the patroness of Argentina. And currently, thousands of people walk the pilgrimage to the Basilica every year. And I wondered how Mary became such an important figure, not only in the lives of Argentinian Catholics, but in those of the overall Latin American Catholics as well. So this paper is about Marian veneration, but I will specifically deal with Marian devotion in the context of Latin America. Here, Marian veneration refers to religious devotions and beliefs exclusively dedicated to Mary. So this paper intends to address that the beliefs and practices of Marian veneration have been blended with the worship of local female deities. And furthermore, such a unique practice of Marian veneration has later been enhanced and flourished in most Latin American countries, largely due to the hegemony of Catholic Church there. And their teachings, in turn, still exercise tremendous influences on people's interpretation about gender roles, and so therefore, this paper intends to show how religious beliefs and practices are reshaped and readapted when they encounter a new culture, how they reconcile with their local religious practices, and how they eventually become a tool that people use to provide explanation of certain ideologies. So I'll first introduce the history and origin of Marian veneration in Latin America and its encounter with the female deities there. Then I will address how Marian veneration influences machismo in Latin America. But since Latin America covers a large number of countries, we should be careful not to generalize that Marian devotion as well as the machismo are practiced and interpreted in the exact same way in every country of Latin America. Rather, we suggest that since Catholicism there is, began with the Spanish colonization, and it is still the largest religious organization in most Latin American countries, it can be argued that those countries share some commonalities when it comes to the practice and belief of Marian veneration as well as machismo. So, one thing we should know before discussing Marian devotion is the Spanish word mestizaje, which means fusion or blend, functions as the cultural identity of Latin America. Indeed, Latin America has a mestizaje of culture, race, and religion, which began with the Spanish colonization and later followed by numerous waves of immigrants from different countries all over the world. So we can also explore Catholicism in Latin America through the same prism of mestizaje as a Catholicism of mestizaje. As you know, the conquest and colonization of Latin America and the religious zeal of the colonizers to disseminate Catholicism in the continent created the initial encounter and assimilation of Mary with the indigenous female deities. In fact, the Church had been using the Virgin in conversion attempts in Western Europe for centuries. They redefined, reformed, and reinterpreted practices of other religions according to Christian principles. In fact, the Church had two techniques known as repression on one hand and toleration and incorporation on the other hand. However, although some of the early missionaries and friars promoted tolerance to a certain extent to indigenous elements when it comes to proselytism, it can be argued that overall the history of European colonization in Latin America was extremely horrendous and cruel. The colonization process was violent and many times took place in a very oppressive and cruel context where the human dignity of the native population was not taken into consideration. There was a huge gap, a serious contradiction between the gospel that the settlers came to share and the horrendous atrocities that the same people committed. So it was natural for the people to resist against the colonizers' religion that humiliated, exploited, and killed them. Nevertheless, there was also some early missionaries such as Bartolomé de las Casas, Montesinos, and Juan del Valle, who fought for the justice and rights of the natives to a certain degree. So gradually, the religious zeal of the colonizers and missionaries to implement Catholicism during the colonial era, we can say that it paved the initial way that culminated in the encounter of Mary with the native religion. Some scholars even argue that Mary was the hinge that united the two cultures because they venerated the same universal mother, and eventually they began to create a common history. In other words, these two cultures, which seemed worlds apart, found common affection and veneration towards Mary. Another point is this. The apparition of Guadalupe in 1531 is especially significant in the history of Marian veneration in Latin America because first, her image was not the one which the Western colonizers were used to, like white and European. Rather, she had mestizo features. Her eyes are slightly slanted and half closed, and more importantly, she appeared to the native Indian believer Juan Diego. Also, Guadalupe emblazoned her face on Juan Diego's tilma, a cave of book, as an affirmation of his vision. Her message was to build a temple where she would show her generosity, love, and help to all of her sons, not only Europeans, but anyone who calls upon her. The apparition of Mary of Guadalupe was interpreted that she was the universal mother who also cared for her indigenous sons. And also her apparition on the indigenous garment marked the birth of an authentically Mexican Catholicism. But it should be clarified that at the beginning of colonization, the native people viewed Mary as the version of their enemies, and she was a symbol of the strength of the enemies who brought them a complete defeat. And most indigenous people showed reluctance to protest the process of religious and cultural assimilation. However, as I said before, there are several factors that united the natives, that led the native people to Marian devotion. The apparition of Guadalupe, along with other apparitions in different parts of the continent, devotion of some friars and missionaries, which were often contrasted to the barbarities of the colonizers, and lastly, the indigenous devotion towards the divine femininity. So the concept of mother goddess has a universal implication, and the indigenous society had a special devotion to Mother Earth in their worship. They had their own legends and myths about Mother Earth, and they named like Pachamama, Talatsin, Maria Leonza, and others. In every Latin American region, there was a worship of the divine femininity, which was represented by moon, earth, fertility, water, mother, etc. The image on the left side is Donatsin. For example, the Indian reverence for the moon, the queen or Goya of the Incan society and consort of the sun, was nicely assimilated with the image of Mary as the queen. So the image in the middle. Others report that the festival honoring Our Lady of Assumption was initially a mass for worshipping Pariacaca, an Indian mountain deity. As such, Mary was often associated with the local female deities, and although such an association of Mary with local deity was controversial because Mary was worshipped as a sort of mother goddess next to others, this peculiar affection to the femininity eventually served as the bridge that led the natives, Criollos, and the Europeans to call upon the Virgin from different contexts and cultures. For some people, Mary was the conqueror. For others, she was their mother who gave hope in the midst of discrimination and exploitation. And she was the one who defended her sons in times of crisis. It can be said that Mariology took root in the cultures of different regions and groups since the beginning of the colonization and became an essential part of their faith, incorporating the characteristics of each culture. She was the mother of God, and she was the mother of everyone. So today, Mary is the patroness of 15 Latin American countries. You can see, like, as I said, Luzon, Copacabana in Bolivia, and you have also Guadalupe in Mexico, Guadalupe in Venezuela, etc. So now, I want to talk about Mary Machinha. We have seen how Mary was first introduced to Latin America and Marian devotion was blended with local cultures and religions. For many, she became the universal mother for every culture in Latin America. Such a Marian veneration has evolved within the Catholic Church, often defending the authorities of the Church and their secular norms and ideologies. Now we want to explore how this Marian veneration still affects people's worldview today, especially when it comes to machismo. So Mary is considered the mother of God, right? But for Latin American communities, the name of Mary has another connotation, the universal maternity. She's my mother as well as our mother. In Latin America, the maternity of Mary and the relationship between Mary and her community is very much highlighted. For example here, Evita Perón in Argentina, she's the first lady of Perón, President Perón, is still considered by many as the spiritual mother of Argentinians, was strongly associated with the Virgin. Also, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, a movement organized by the mothers who had lost their sons during the military repression, often conduct activities within a Marian framework. They use illustrations of Mary as a suffering mother to emphasize their connection to her. In addition, the maternal aspect of Mary influences the way people perceive gender imbalances, also known as machismo, a form of sexism that is still prevalent in many parts of Latin America. Stillman knows that only 8% out of the entire executive boards of 348 companies in Latin America are women. While the importance of sexual equality is widely recognized, the progress towards it seems to be very slow. In Latin America, there is still a barrier that defines the role of women. A woman is someone who takes care of the family, while the man goes out to work. And this is one of the aspects of Latin American machismo. So in short, machismo means an over-evaluation of male gender in the social context. It is also translated as man's uncontrolled, arrogant, and dominant autonomy both in the society and the house. The problem is that this over-worship to the male gender reduces the virtues of women, imposing on them a negative symbol. So for machos, female gender lacks value. And at the same time, for men, a macho must always be strong, hard, violent, clever, and astute. Though their world doesn't know affection, feeling, forgiveness, and mercy. They create a world of winners that eventually generates injustice. But the only safe place where they can find affection is in their home, essentially from the relationship of mother and son. The mother represents forgiveness for machos. She's their refuge, help, and assistance. This somehow explains their closeness to the Virgin than to Jesus. She also means reconciliation to the brothers who are confronted and separated. This ideal and salvific image of a woman as mother is profoundly linked to the maternity of the Virgin. In the Latin American community where machismo is still prevalent, Mary is projected as their merciful mother who always forgives, helps, and reconciles in favor of her sons. Also, she embraces her daughters when they become the victims of that kind of society. However, it should be noted that Marian devotion many times paints the picture of the ideal woman that defines how women should act. And Saquile claims Marianism dictates the ideal womanhood by which every Latina is expected to live by, passive, submissive, and self-sacrificial. Therefore, on the one hand, we have Mary that functions as the protector of our daughters who live under the emotional and cultural pressure of the society of machismo. Mary gives them consolation and strength to move forward. However, on the other hand, Marian devotion in Latin America prescribes stereotypes of women and how they should behave. Interestingly, Evelyn P. Stevens claims that women are clearly the victims of machismo that frames the roles of the ideal women, with Mary being the example of their traditional female virtues. However, she claims that such norms are partly imposed by women themselves as well, since women are the ones who are in charge of education and socialization of their sons in private areas. I'm going to jump to the conclusion. Yeah. So, The beliefs and practices of Marian veneration in Latin America reveal how religions, when they are adapted to a local culture and religion, create a unique set of values and practices, which in turn have a long-lasting impacts on people's understanding of certain aspects of their culture, such as gender roles. We have explored the case of Marian veneration in Latin America, which was originally an alien concept brought by the colonizers, and it was soon associated and reinterpreted in light of the native people's beliefs in local female divinities. Marian veneration continued to evolve and grow within the Catholic Church in Latin America. Today still plays a major role in influencing and even consolidating the traditional gender roles characterized by machismo in many parts of Latin American societies. Perhaps our next step would be to compare how Marian veneration is being practiced in other parts of the world, like in Asia, and see if it has the same implication in terms of gender roles in the society. Dhala.
Thanks so much for the richness of the three of those papers. I appreciate the real emphasis on the agency of women and the agency of women deities that I was hearing in each of your papers in different ways. But I'd love to open it up for questions for any of our or all of our panelists. If folks could, as we raise our hands and ask our questions, introduce ourselves. And just maybe your name from where you're coming, and then to raise your question. That would be lovely. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Marcia Ledford, and I have a question about what is your plan to do in terms of Shia publications when you're done with your work here?
Well, I know that one project that would help the Shia literature a lot would be the translations of their works, especially their theories and methodologies into English. Being in the interdisciplinary seminar and also in the methods and theories course that I am as a doctoral student, I find it so heavily, predominantly Christian. And I find myself navigating through the terminology, having to translate everything that I've known as a body of science into a totally different language. So I think one of the very useful projects would be to have translations of the works, like right from the 10th century up to now, into English. And I think that would open up that body to access by a lot of researchers. I'm currently working on my dissertation, which is the Sermon of Fatima, and I'd really like to, present that piece as a verbal protest by a woman. So there's just a lot in narrative poetry. There's a lot in spiritual practices where women are leaders of those spiritual practices. The list is long.
Thank you. What other questions do we have? Please.
It's probably directed to all three of you. So I draw a distinction between theological, or in this case, THEA, theological studies, and religious studies, in that religious studies use certain methodologies, and some of you have used that in your presentation. And the distinction that I draw is in theological studies, we are sometimes talking about spiritual things which cannot really be quantified, right? And it seems to me that women in general, when they have to somehow subvert patriarchal traditions, they draw on various aspects of culture. But I think that as theological students, we need to keep in mind that it seems that they are also drawing on power, right? So what would you think is the most significant factor for women to basically transgress or to subvert patriarchy. I know you spoke about using women's voices and in reinterpretation of scriptures, and I like that. But what would you say would be like a central factor that you see, because this is all contextualized so very differently that it's really difficult to sort of decontextualize everything. But in general, would you say there is one thing that you think is most important from your study that women could use in order to break down certain barriers?
My response comes from both the Yogini-s that I studied, some of the theories that I used to understand their ritual, and also my own experience. So in my process, for not just this project, but for other projects, I was looking at some like cognitive semiotics, right? And how new meanings are made. And I think it was George Lakoff talked about it a lot, how, and especially in poetry and art, we have metaphor as like this primary vehicle where one thing means another thing. And what I see with these Yogini-s in particular is the appropriation of certain cultural symbols, right, that are normative, that everybody understands. And they use that, but they turn it just a little bit, right? So the example of Radhagiri, there's this notion of, Yogini madness or ferocity. And to people who are living outside her circle of followers, they understand that as being a quality of the Yogini, but it doesn't mean that she lacks control, and in fact it's instrumental, right? And so that's how she's using this to kind of reassert her Shakti or her power, to take a commonly used metaphor and give it some new life. And I think that just as being a woman, and not even just in like the spiritual world, but like in the academic world, I find that I might appropriate a certain notion of like what a scholarly woman is supposed to be like, and then turning it just a little bit so that I have a little bit more freedom, and in that process, hopefully transgressing some categories.
So if I would just add to that, that beautiful answer would be, in my studies, or where my area of concentration is, I think if women started to be a little more confident with their own interpretation and find authenticity in their own intellects, speaking only from my community and the experiences I've had with the interaction within my community, the women in my community, is that when things are authenticated by a male voice, do women find satisfaction in it? I know that as women exegetes, there is Banu Amin, who in 1960 published her 15-volume exegesis of the Qur'an. And there aren't many Muslim women who know of this. So I wish they would look for their, trust their intellect and authenticate it and build a community where they can take charge. And they can be involved in the lawmaking process. They can be there guiding the norms of the culture. So I think that is what I would see women being involved in this method of getting to their text.
Please. So, Mahjabeen, this goes to Laura and Mahjabeen in particular, because you're representing or speaking of traditions that are highly problematized within the secular academy, within the research academy. And Mahjabeen, you put it out there right at the beginning, okay? This situation, very clearly. So one of the points that I would want to ask you both to keep it to consider as you go forward with your work, both Laura and Mahjabeen, is that the area studies framework, the methodologies of area studies, as it is applied to religions is highly problematic. Okay? It's not that it should not be studied regionally or globally. Of course it should. What I'm saying is it should not only be studied regionally or globally. So that you are a Shia woman here in Berkeley. That cannot be completely undermined. And Laura's work, she's, she's a Hawaiian American. Her work cannot be undermined because neither of you are in some war zone or, in a village in a remote location. So the acceptance of your voice, even though it is coming from the West, even though it is coming from, quote, a privileged region, is something you will have to fight for. It's a caveat and an exhortation.
And hopefully an inspiration also.
Yes, most of the things that come out of our mouth, either.
Professor Marcia.
I was just going to say we did not hear from the third presenter in response to Pravina's question, and I'd like to hear her voice as well.
Thank you. Hanna, did you have thoughts to add? Pravina, would you like to repeat your question for Hanna?
Yeah, basically what I want to know is that the context for each of these topics is different, but what would you consider as the most central factor for a woman to break patriarchal barriers or to break certain things?
Oh, yeah, I think I agree with my colleagues, and I think that the key would be the hermeneutical approach, how you bring in someone or biblical figure to your own life and give it new meanings and more creative interpretations and more constructive thoughts to it. That's what the Latin American Catholics are doing. They use Marian veneration. It's all on the one hand is it might hinder gender equality because she is the image of traditional women, female virtues. But on the other hand, we have liberation theologians use Marian veneration or Mariology as the force of liberating women and the less privileged. So it also all depends how you approach it and what meaning you want to give to it constructively.
Please. It's for Hanna. You mentioned in the beginning that Marian, or the symbol of Mary, in South America is sort of like a syncretic blend of, the Catholic Mary and the indigenous divine feminine in the area. I don't know any of the names for it. But in any of your research, did you find any qualities of that indigenous figure coming through in Mary beyond like the way that she looks? Like, were there any like specific like traits, features that wouldn't necessarily be considered Marian features?
As far as I know, I think the features regarding the public relation is very much highlighted in the Marian veneration in Latin America. How Mary function, how the divine femininity function in their lives of the native people, right? With the urban agriculture, fertility, and that's blended with the image of Mary that's from the Western side.
Other thoughts or questions? Please.
On Marianism, my question to you is it affecting from the grassroots level? Is it beginning to affect ecclesiastical doctrine? Is it beginning to, go up the authoritative ladder, where Mariology itself, in systematic theology, begins to be affected, at least, somewhat? Or is it remaining in the realm of praxis, but not leading into theology.
I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think it's more at the grassroots level, because at the doctrinal level, they warrant the overt worship of Mary. But still, in Argentina, you see like worship being the Virgin everywhere, so I think it's more the community level, the collegial level.
I'd like to add to that as well. I'm thinking about the work of Jeanette Rodriguez, who's an alum of the GTU, who's done a lot of research on Our Lady of Guadalupe earlier on in her career. And she's starting to, or has argued that Our Lady of Guadalupe can be seen as an image of the Holy Spirit, and Orlando Espín is beginning to pick up on some of that idea. And another person whose work I would recommend on this topic, who's connecting some of the grassroots to some of the work that folks are doing on the level of doctrine and dogma, is Marcela Albaz-Reed, who is who was an Argentinian liberation theologian, who speaks very clearly to this idea that the stakes are very high, along the lines of the impact that these Mariological ideals have on women of the grassroots. That the stakes are high in the sense that the consequences of these Mariological ideals have to do with violence, especially domestic violence within the home among straight couples. And she was one who was starting to lift up some of those conversations to be considered by folks who are in positions to make decisions to change them.
So the space exists clearly within pneumatology, which is the least systematized of systematic categories, right? And so that, so your answer is that there are some theologians working in that direction.
And part of the reason that I'm speaking to this is I hope that my work will fit in that direction. And I don't want to talk too much about my own work. I'm not a panelist tonight or this morning, but I'd love to take that conversation up during the break. I don't want to take up too much time for the group. Any final questions? We have room for one more. Please.
I'm Joy Barnett. I'm actually a PSR MDiv several years ago. And one of my comments, it's not really a question, but it's an observation, is that all three of you touched on the fact that it's local interpretation of original text. And I'm just struck by how often we don't go to the original text and the variations that may have mutated through copying and inquire with our own experience and our own perspective, claiming the voice of here's how I interpret it and what I'm offering. So I heard that in all three of you, and I commend that.
I think that's a lovely note on which to end. Let's go ahead and thank our panelists.
And to all the panelists, and we'll reconvene at 11, but there's some snacks and yeah.
It's Operation Move Car.
What's that?
I have to move my car.
Ah, yes. The joys of 2-hour parking in Berkeley.
Nice to meet you, Jenna.
Yeah, right. Only because I just heard
clapping. You know, I went through your Facebook, I was like, no, it's here. He's like, you sure it's not online? I was like, let me find it. I said, no, I'm looking at it. I said, I just posted it. They said, there's one you're clapping. I said, I'm clapping. He's like, sorry. I was like, oh, hello. Yeah, I'm just going to
Yeah, just find the empty chair and squeeze it in.
I don't know if I can squeeze in there, girl. Hi.
I'm Sheryl.
Hi, Sheryl. I'm Shia. Nice to meet you.
Are you from Canada?
Yes, I am.
She does a great job of getting spring awards.
Yeah, so I'm excited to be here. I'm sad that I missed the
Yeah, it's hard to get a full day of Anyway, help yourself to some snack.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
What in terms of going on
So I'm just going to use
I have the teaching class, I missed the first half.
And I have to leave for South Bay.
But I changed that and I did a word cloud, so I went through the Yogini teachers, Yogini-s, some secondary sources, including David White, and I pulled out common words, like this is the lesbian, about like sex and I think the word cloud is like it's not exhaustive, but it illustrated common terms in the text. The only way I can small it, interesting. Yeah, not all is
I wonder what David Gordon White wrote about. You know, background you know, when he went to the Catholic schools.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I thought I was in trouble. I was like, don't call me that.
It was interesting sometimes. I have to give a talk and have a meeting.
Oh my gosh.
It's fundraising, you know? And sometimes we find it very
How are you?
Because I just found her so divine. It was like, oh my gosh, she's a goddess. She's a goddess. Yeah, it's great.
How are you, my brilliant one? Oh, good to see you.
And then how was your wonderful trip?
Oh, it was just, hi, how are you? It was just wonderful. Be in a place with womanist scholars from all over the nation.
I'd like to be a butterfly on the wall.
It was just
Wonderful.
oh, I'll have to share with you the pictures.
It's like, do you have an additional meeting? You should have an additional meeting at the AAR.
Well, the womenist, yeah, the womenist have an in-gathering Friday before officially starts, and that's where women that can get there early come. Relationally as a gathering, because as you know, they are so big, they mingle with each other and the rest of them. And then there are related scheduled right against each other. So we can't
Mangoes over here, I'm so disappointed. Yeah, here. That's what I realized that it's not here.
Because the thing that we do on Friday afternoon, 1 to 4, we're not necessarily as much as just sharing about Kathy and about our journeys How's your dad? He's much better.
I don't know what the dip is. It's like green cheese flavor, isn't it?
How is it? It's the same thing when you first started working.
Yeah, he brought back, not everybody, but just about.
Oh, that's wow, and this is here or Arizona? Yeah, so probably over there. I'll say, would you look at this thing?
Really exciting. I really like her.
There's a lot more in there.
I'm sorry, what did you say your name was again?
I'm Joy.
Joy. And I said my name? I don't recall. Gordon. Sorry about that. Gordon. Nice to meet you.
Me too. I have more than many years.
It's one of those unique books. I think my parents were and whenever I meet another Gordon, it's kind of like a minor miraculous event. Similarity. Yep.
Because I know
Figure your risk, I guess.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that it's hard to everybody already so
Yeah. We actually, yeah, we can definitely. Why is it? Right, exactly.
You should start.
Okay, so let's talk about it for maybe, look at our schedules for Tuesday. Yeah. Sounds great. I'm so sorry. But I'm glad it was taken. Busy is for sure.
Okay, well, thanks for being here for this. Yes, How are you doing today?
I am still trying to reacclimate.
Oh, right. Yes, how was
And all the same.
I was tired. Okay, well, I have to do
So I didn't know part thing.
all the first
When your woman is pregnant.
If my woman is for boy, my pen, that's right. And I had the chance to. Oh, okay.
It's hard.
Does she know where to come? Oh, okay, Getting down, if she's coming 13, getting down 13. And then getting I said, what is there something going on this Friday that I don't know about? So here, once I got 13, what's the next day? Yeah, but then once she got to Berkeley decides what is it.
You should present.
Tell me why that was a challenge for me to learn. But it helps so much to learn to have to say, this is
And then I think, I have some conspiracy theory that in order to be a proper undergraduate school, the orientation teaches you to go one at a time across the street so that the traffic never gets to go.
Oh, okay. You don't think information. That's so good.
And then they walk as if they don't even have to.
That's right, that's right. Yeah. So you're trying to get across the top of campus and it takes you longer than it took you to come down.
And sometimes it's faster.
Used to work.
But I'm Joy. I'm and I knew Keyona really well. Studied. Because I took a couple classes. One class actually at Keyona.
Okay.
And one taught by someone.
Maybe you should
Let me see your face. That's hilarious.
Thank you. It is
That Julia Morgan.
It's lovely when we get a chance to really stop and
What's 11?
Oh, it's a half an hour break. Right.
Okay, hopefully I'm really ready. I'm ready. Wow, generous with you.
I know, that is a lot.
Yeah.
I hope we get.
We were working on it. Keyona, do you know in the roundabout? I mean, Sheryl really
Oh, okay.
together.
Yeah.
What's your name? I'm Nora. Hi, Nora. Nice to meet you. I'm Jen. Oh no, is that that conference? Nice. Yeah, totally. Yeah, we're still coming back. Every time I come back, I'm like, oh, I got to schedule the day after to relocate, but I never did. Here we are. Exactly.
Oh, yes, tell me about it. I did that.
Oh, awesome.
It is. Ooh, it's good.
Yeah. Is that really cool class? That's awesome. It's a great class.
This is regular, so it's got Kathy.
Oh, that's what I want.
Yeah. Totally. Oh, great.
I'm just like sitting there, it's overwhelmed, like, what is it? That's what we have, when I asked, but now I was like, in the story moments. Oh, but in any of these, so I took out the scripts.
Love you so much.
Fatima is the name of
How are you doing?
No.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Oh, so is that Shia? My name is
Yeah. Like, how long is this?
This is the name of the book.
Okay.
So there is one, in 1437. Is there a translation for it? Sure, so it's chapter 14, verse 37. So that's how you get things in the Quran. So the first one is usually the chapter. Right. The second is like the verse. So what the Quran is that's not a feminist interpretation, that's just the Quran. That's just the verse. It's the primary text. Okay. And then there are people who work around it and do the traditions and how it was set down and understood by other people. It's like most of these persons. It's like the first one practiced, the second one practiced. And over the centuries, people just practiced the same interpretation. Oh, yeah. I just want to send you an email, but I can do that right now.
No, I didn't realize everyone would to. I thought it would, but oh well. I don't know. We can also plug it in over here too, under the table, so that way people won't have to walk past. Yeah. It's fine. Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah.
Mahjabeen presented on and then we had Hanna presenting on Marian, and then Laura Dunn presented on Stewardship. Well, I had a good number of friends on the first panel, so I had to make sure to make it work. Bringing some of the tips.
I'm Jennifer. Great to meet you. Yeah, looking forward to hearing you speak, yes. Wonderful.
These two are first year students.
Okay, cool.
There you go. Yeah, so I mean, it's a live stream.
Right, definitely, yeah, that's, you don't have to do that, sign up for it.
Joy, do you know we're going to have a video recording of this?
What was that?
Are we going to have a video recording of the presentations?
I don't know.
Okay. First, I was just, your proximity to the camera maybe, but that's just...
Jennifer might know.
Jennifer?
So, you know, it should be all right in the fridge at the same time. You have to serve recording because I'm just trying to tend to design them.
That could be.
I don't know, she will answer that.
You and Ebony really need to just go for the justice. Which I could have just shortcut. Space for buy some get the right now, and then How are you? Yes, for sure. Yes, she presented as, yes, A.R. West. I'm interested to see and your topics sound interesting. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
So there's going to be a live stream happening, but then we'll can you see this morning?
Yeah.
So there we go.
Hopefully the sound comes up.
Like a list of lessons that we're learning from this conference.
Yeah. We get away from this hetero Christianity kind of Oh, of her work. Oh, then I take
Well, you're also like spread all over the place. The Center for Global Studies,
right. The reason we talk about that is your intellectual property. You should not be publishing. If you ever want to go forward later and get it published, then it's already out there and published. So that's for your protection.
So that's not too much. But
there is a GTU journal here that you can get published in, and then it is organized. But for us to put it out on things would not work. So
yeah, it's nice to be able to just
a person who don't know about the journal, what the process is, not necessarily clean studies. So
that's
but Dr. Jen would know, or maybe Sheryl, who is our coordinator for WFW. I've seen every now and then journals, all the papers. The other one that was really good is the Davis. Because he's over all of the communications for GTU. And that journal is, I think, specifically it might be familiar, but once it's printed, National Library of Congress registered medium, then you're covered. Let them do it, yeah, because that pronunciation, well, they probably have their own copyright, and you're okay. Because in the future, what that does, it allows you to write a paper when I gave Keyona at our American Baptist Rereading, all of a sudden somebody's whole PDF comes up, that's not cool. Because that person has no control over this thing. Well, no, he does. Yeah, so I can tell they if there is
The total opposite of trying to get my
And I'm happy to say so, all right.
Is everyone good? Get started.
And then I can run down.
Yeah, I'll do it, and then I'll read it out.
Yes.
Set it up now and
That sounds great.
No, I mean,
I'll probably move
tough
it
conversation,
to
but I was thinking I told them that getting ordained in the UCC.
So the folks are asking, this is being paid, not licensed.
Both.
Both? Oh, okay.
Do we have to sign a release?
It won't matter, no. Ideally, yes, is the answer to your question. It's gone from being something we did rarely to something everybody wants to do all of a sudden. And so the policies are not yet catching up to the desire for people to do this. Hopefully that's a summer project. But we are informally asking all the presenters, are you okay with this? But that shouldn't be done informally. It should be.
No, I was going to be punched.
Oh, did we not, you were not informed?
I didn't,
Are you
or else
okay with
I
it?
read, I didn't, or else I shouldn't read it. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'll be okay. I'm old enough now I can be outed as a religious person.
Thank you. I'm sorry you weren't asked. Those
Well, I guess
are,
I also look for things that I have to sign.
yes, right. Those are the exact questions that I have a person coming in to work with me on.
And I
I'm
want to say
done.
hi. I remember you from a class I took in leadership back at ABSW
Oh,
in
okay.
all of 2014.
Okay.
Did you finish your degree?
I did,
And now you're working up the hill while your wife works down the hill?
pretty much.
Separated by what, 2 miles?
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, I remember that class. I was very glad I got to take the class.
Were you?
Oh, what a trip. And an exciting one. I've used things I learned in that class. Mostly ways of presenting things.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So welcome for our second session for today's conference. And our second session will be focused on ethical demands. And we have 3 presenters for today. Okay, so here they are already. Without me calling them. Okay, before I introduce them, let me introduce myself. My name is Mariska Lotagom. You can call me Ika, Aika. Just remember IKEA. Leave behind the E. And I'm the second year PhD student here at the GPU. And my concentration is on religion and practice.
Okay, so we have three presenters for today. The first is Keyona Saquile Lazenby, and she will be talking about Eco-womanist ethics and African spirituality. And then the second presenter is Sheryl Johnson. She will be talking about stewardship is not just personal, it is political. And the third presenter is Marcia Ledford, and she will be talking about the persistent widow through Latina eyes. Keyona, Reverend Keyona Saquile Lazenby is the founder of Blessed is She, an interfaith women's ministry that supports women from various spiritual and religious backgrounds achieve self-actualization. Keyona is passionate about providing pre- and post-release services to justice-involved populations. An avid traveler, and she believes that cultural exploration is the world's greatest teacher. She received her master's in social transformation and certificate of women's studies in religion from Pacific School of Religion and from a Graduate Theological Union. And Reverend Keyona is an ordained interfaith minister and graduate of One Spirit Interfaith Seminary. And our second presenter, Sheryl Johnson, is a second-year PhD student here at the GTU, focusing on Christian economic ethics. Her particular area of research is the financial and stewardship practices of mainline churches, looking at the disconnect between the economic justice statements, positions of these churches in comparison with their practices as they experience decline. Sheryl is an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada, a progressive denomination formed in 1925 of Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregationalist churches. She served in congregational ministry as well as in a fundraising capacity with Kairos, a national ecumenical justice organization in Canada prior to attending the GPU. Her other interests include theology, ecumenism, Christian social, ecological ethics, Christian education, and critical social theory. And our third presenter, the Reverend Marcia Ledford's ministry is with the Latin population in Southwest Detroit, an international port with an aggressive ICE director. Ledford has witnessed the effects of an archaic and punitive immigration act that systematically pulls families apart and traumatizes children. And as a civil rights attorney, Ledford has dedicated her life's work to representing the marginalized in society. She is an Episcopal priest who holds a Master of Divinity from the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. And Ledford is a candidate for a Doctor of Ministry from Pacific School of Religion. So this is our three presenters, and they will have, each of them will have 15 to 20 minutes time of presenting their interesting papers. And then we can have 30 minutes for Q&A after that. And I would like to invite you to speak loudly so our friends at home can hear our questions and our voice. Okay, let us give a big applause for our team.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Today I will be presenting a paper on eco-womanism in African spirituality in Antil-Ecology to Carceral Anti-Ecology. One of the fastest growing United States business sectors is the criminal justice system. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, there are over 2.3 million people in 1,719 state prisons, 102 federal prisons, 942 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,283 local jails, and 79 Indian country jails, as well as the military prisons, immigration detention facilities, civil commitment centers, and prisons in the United States territories. What impact have these carceral institutions had on the environment, land, and human beings? Most of the federal and state prisons are located in rural farm areas. Thousands of acres are being cleared of its natural habitats and resources to build and operate these prisons. Carceral institutions produce numerous toxins and waste that pollute the air, contaminate nearby water sources and land, in addition to harming staff and inmates. These prisons are located in predominantly poor communities and that are populated by Black and brown people. There is a for-profit business model called the Prison Industrial Complex that through its operations and productions destroy rural farmland, poison communities with toxins, and exploits prison laborers. Within the prison industrial complex, government entities and private corporations establish contracts with prisons for free or reduced fee labor to produce consumer goods or administer services. This complex is fueled by the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. Communities, families, and lives have been destroyed based solely on this harsh bill. Numerous in-depth studies exist regarding the impact of prison industrial complex from psychological, sociological, and economic perspectives. Such studies have shown that the prison industry complex is undergirded by racism, classism, and capitalism. This inhumane complex has been dubbed the new Jim Crow. In America's southern past, Jim Crow laws imposed racial segregation, and Black people experience racial, economic, and social disadvantages. Clergy, activists, and concerned people must organize and work to dismantle the prison industry complex. New legislation must be created and adapted to halt the building of carceral institutions. An increase in funding to community-based and faith-based organizations to provide pre- and post-release programming and services that include housing assistance and job support, job readiness, substance abuse treatment, mental health, and cognitive behavioral therapy is necessary to combat the negative impact of systems that are currently in place. An oversight committee should be appointed to ensure that these carceral institutions abide by environmental justice principles. It is heart-wrenching to know that the land that we live on, nature we depend on, and human beings we should be in fellowship and partnership with are negatively affected by these carceral institutions. A new field is emerging called carceral anti-ecology, where environmentalists argue that the prison industry complex is a huge environmental justice issue. One acclaimed feminist and author, Bell Hooks, stated that we are concerned about the fate of the planet, and some of us believe that the living simply is a part of the revolutionary political practice. We have a sense of the sacred. The ground we stand on is shifting, fragile, and unstable. I argue that eco-womanist ethics grounded in African and Native indigenous spiritual practices will prove effective against carceral anti-ecology because reverence for human bodies, land, and environments must be restored to organize and provide a foundation to dismantle the prison industrial complex. In Sophia Bittencourt's article, Between Dishwater and the River, she states that eco-womanism seeks to build a new space of ethical engagement. This third wave of womanism embraces African and Native American indigenous spiritual beliefs and practices that ethically engage with fellow human beings, nature, environment, and elements. An ancient Ghanaian tribe, the Nkani, believes that social, cultural patterns of life are rooted in traditional values and norms. Within my own Ifa spiritual tradition, all living beings have a unique spirit and sacred name. Honor is bestowed upon nature's elements, animals, Egun, which are ancestors, and deities, which are the Orishas. Yoruba is the language that Ifa practitioners speak when invoking our spiritual guides, petitioning our Orishas, or feeding our Egun ancestors. How we interact with all living things must be acknowledged through their own specialness and should be treated with care. In these traditions, religious and spiritual beliefs serve as points of inspiration and motivation to address social justice and environmental justice issues. The cycle of life and death between human, earth, elements, nature, land, and animals depend on each other for its existence, growth, and sustainability. African and Native American spirituality could be utilized to eradicate the presence of carceral anti-ecology. All carceral institutions are a threat to the interconnectedness of the divine, human, and the natural realm, and the web of life. The causes and effect of carceral anti-ecology are centered in the politics of domination. Feminist bell hooks describe the politics of domination as interlocking axis of race, gender, species, and class oppression, belief in domination, and a belief in the notions of superior and inferior, which are all components of those systems. Systems of domination include racism, classism, sexism, animalism, ableism, and more. The earth, trees, soil, river, lakes, ocean, birds, and humans are under attack, and survival is at stake through politics of domination. The politics of domination are upheld by white supremacy. White supremacy is the belief in systems in which white people are superior to all races, species, and environments and should therefore dominate all of these life forms. Eco-feminist Kang states that from the beginning, women have had to grapple with the historical projection of human concepts onto the nature, which was later utilized to fortify masculine notions about feminine nature. Eco-womanist ethics provide a framework to help to interpret false ideologies and oppose systemic violence wreaking havoc on Earth. The Eurocentral masculinist worldview that dominates Western thought tends to value only portions of reality that can be exploited in the interest of profit, power, and control. Not only is anything that is associated with nature deemed amenable to conquest, but also viewed as a conquest that requires no moral self-examination on the part of the prospective conqueror. This worldview has influenced the prison industrial complex and led to the increase in the ecological footprints made by carceral institutions. According to the carceral Antil-Ecology, the prison industry complex environmental racism article, 7 million acres of open space, wildlife habitat, and farmland have been transformed by the United States and federal prison complex. There's a prison open somewhere in rural America every 15 days. Wow. Yes, that's astonishing, right? Across America, carceral institutions are being built and farmlands destroyed. Author and Yoruba priestess Louisa Tish articulates the needs for everyone to actively eliminate patriarchy, white supremacy, and classism along the domination of non-human nature. In our spiritual tradition, the earth is a sanctuary for all species, where all living entities are valued and considered to be sacred. The preservation and conservation of the earth should be served as a motivator to end carceral anti-ecology and the prison industry complex. A Yoruba proverb states that the things that you do are the things that you worship. This proverb rings true for the perpetrators of the prison industry complex. Capitalism practiced in any form means of domination of land, sea, and air, and the people must be destroyed. Reverence and respect for nature must be brought to the forefront to muster the strength and will to stop the buildings of carceral institutions and eliminate laws that funnel Black and brown people into them. An ethic of eco-womanism is acknowledged as well as respected for the ecosystems. Nature is the broadest sense of the word, is not empty, impersonal object or phenomenon. It is filled with religious significance. African religious heritage links Africans with creation of universe, whether visible or invisible. The stars, moon, sun, cloud, mist, rain, wind, lightning, storms, animals, plants, and rivers all manifest the presence of the Creator. One of the many ethics that eco-womanists live by is to do no harm. At the foundation of dominant Western thought exists an intense ambivalence among humankind's place in the biosphere, not only in relation to one another, but in also relation to non-human nature. The moral and environmental injustices experienced through carceral anti-ecology impacts people, land, and the environment. The predominantly Black and brown bodies housed in these carceral institutions suffer exposure to harmful toxins and waste that cause illness, disease, and death, and due to the negative impacts such as institutions should be eradicated. These men and women produce textiles, electronic commodities that result in water and air pollution. Unfortunately, these individuals have not received proper training and lack appropriate protective gear and clothing that impact the handling of such material. Numerous consumer goods are manufactured in these institutions, often for little to no pay with a high level of toxic exposure. The Environmental Protection Agency does not require resources to systematically inspect prison facilities and assembly lines. These Black and brown men and women are experiencing multiple oppressions to their spirits, minds, and bodies. Such carceral institutions are a form of environmental racism as well. Environmental activist Robert Buller defined environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individual groups or communities because of race, color, or race. Some of these carceral institution infrastructures are declining, causing lead poisoning and industrial pollution. Black and brown men and women are living in this toxicity. Renowned womanist theologian and author Dr. Katie Cannon stated that learn how to dispel the threat of death in order to seize the present life. African spirituality recognized that death is pervasive, especially under white supremacy. Now we must utilize our spiritual principles, powers, and rituals and practices to change how they are operated and governed and eventually dismantle them. The prison industry complex is a form of slavery. In Michelle Alexander's best-selling book, The New Jim Crow and the Age of Colorblindness, she shares that mass incarceration and prison industry complex are a new form of segregation that have been enacted since the age of Jim Crow. Black and brown people are forced into these carceral institutions and essentially made into new slaves. The mental, emotional, and physical abuse that these men and women endure is horrifying. They experience persistent ecological fear regarding their bodies. These men and women suffer greatly because of their degraded status. Corporation profits soar because incarcerated men and women manufacture their goods and products for no or greatly reduced cost. It is important to preserve both nature and human dignity. When and where did human beings become viewed as chattel and simply as numbers? For those that have committed offenses against others or violated someone or something, where's the space for atonement, redemption, and salvation? The financial incentives to house and harm Black and brown bodies are at an all-time high. We must take a look at alternatives to incarceration and offer restorative healing options. Through conjuring divine power, organizing, and bringing to the world's attention that the prison industry complex is humane, author Ursula King cautions us to not simply see spirituality as an additional aspect, but as something that develops out of our tensions, the fibers of our experience. The spirit comes forth and meet us not only in and through the movements and events of our time. And I will include eco-womanism. Clergy, activists, and concerned citizens should continue to resist name a new way of being. Environmental justice principles could be adapted and utilized to help address carceral anti-ecology. Black women as environmental justice activists understand that their communities are targeted because they are perceived as being inhabited by inferior, politically disenfranchised, economically disenfranchised people who do not lack social, political, or economic capital, and therefore can be easily dispensed with or ignored. Eco-womanists stand on the shoulders of the powerful pioneer environmental justice activists such as Hazel Johnson. Mama Hazel became involved in environmental justice after learning that her Southside Chicago community had the highest rate of cancer compared to any other area in the city. She began what's called toxic tours of the affected areas and organized conferences to bring attention to their plight. The moral agency of Mama Hazel and other eco-womanists is based in an ethical consciousness that is an articulation of principles and values that affirm the activist humanity and the humanity of those in their community. Similar to African indigenous spirituality, these women are grounded and center their activism in prayer, ritual, witness, and testimony. The distinctive feature of traditional African religion lies in its being a way of life. The purpose of religion is to order our relationship with our fellow men and women and with our environment, both spiritual and physical. At the roots of its quest for harmony between man, the spirit world, nature, and society, it is our divine assignment and responsibility to work against social injustices. Carceral anti-ecology is environmental and social injustice that must be addressed. The environmental justice principles could also help to address this carceral anti-ecology dilemma. One of the principles states that environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Similar to African indigenous spirituality, the importance of life forms must be expressed and revered. There is also an environmental justice principle that redresses disproportionately impacted by targeted action and resources. An organizing body should contact the GEO corporation that profits from the prison industry complex and request funds to tackle carceral anti-ecology. This is one step of the many that we can take to confront this existing ecological challenge. Thank you.
Good morning again, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm just astounded by the participants that are here today. It's beyond our expectations, so thank you again for coming. And yeah, this paper is a paper that I wrote for a class, adapted version for Dr. J. Johnson, and so I apologize for the similarity you may hear in that. And also just to note that I really have tried to focus in more on some of the practical examples, but if you're more interested in some of the theoretical framework within my argument, it's true to have you talk about that later, but I thought the examples were maybe a little bit more interesting and accessible, so I've decided to focus in on that today. So one of the implications of the Christian theology of the incarnation is that matter matters. Stated otherwise, that lived experiences, bodies, and in fact the physical world itself are theologically relevant. This general sentiment is affirmed also in the feminist slogan, "The personal is political," which in part challenges the divide between the public and the private beliefs and practices. I will argue that Christian stewardship is a practice sometimes seen as personal and internal to the church, separate from theology and belief, that requires examination due to its political and theological ethical ramifications. In considering socio-political change, ethicist Maria argues that transformation must be embodied, radical, imaginative, and relational. These commitments are largely shared by feminists and others in women's studies. Zimmerman also argues that social transformation must be rooted in reality, but can defy logic. This paradox, I believe, is particularly relevant to stewardship, as it's a practice that tends to be quite connected to logic, often simplified to simply prudent financial decision-making. In my paper, I will first consider the relationships between the incarnation, social transformation, and stewardship. I will then explore some specific examples of stewardship practices from several recent books about stewardship, evaluating them in relation to Christian ethical values and commitments to social justice. Although stewardship is not commonly considered in relation to Christian ethics and social transformation, I believe this is a critical lens to consider this issue. So the aspects of stewardship that I will consider are honesty and communication, which I think relates to Zimmerman's aspect of relationality, attending to economic diversity within the congregation, which I believe has implications for embodiment, and the use of ideas of scarcity and abundance, which I believe has implications for radicality. The alignment that I suggested between Zimmerman's criteria and these aspects of stewardship could be arranged in other ways, but I believe that these pairings will emphasize a primary aspect of what is at stake in each of these themes in the stewardship literature. While there is widespread support in this literature for a baseline of economic ethics, practices such as regular audits, the use even of an ethical screen on investments, I will argue that it's possible and in fact theologically and ethically justified to go far beyond this so that stewardship can more fully embody and in fact enable justice-based social transformation. Social transformation is emphasized by many who write about the incarnation from a progressive or liberative perspective. Yet integrating the body into theology and practice is not sufficient alone. Theologian M. Sean Copeland argues that we must remember how Jesus' ministry was situated in resistance to the Roman Empire, and Jesus had a specific rather than a generalized body, which should remind us to consider the specifics of people's identities today. While being attentive to the particularities of Jesus' identity, we must remember that he also transgressed the usual boundaries associated with that identity, for example, with respect to gender. I believe that Copeland's arguments are particularly relevant to prophetic considerations of the incarnation in stewardship. It is not sufficient to say that the material needs of the church community are theologically important. We must make these connections in ways that consider the impacts of empire in our own context, asking whether they support or challenge injustice. So now I'll move to the literature. The first prevalent theme I will consider is that of honesty. Honesty in communication when discussing stewardship is something that many authors agree is important. However, I would argue this aspect is more controversial than it might seem, particularly because communication does not simply describe reality and is always value-laden. Many authors writing about stewardship describe the need to shape messages about stewardship in various ways, particularly calling on individuals in leadership to consider the dynamics of how positive one's message should be and whether to share if there is a financial challenge or crisis in the congregation. I believe that when considering honesty in stewardship practices, the aspect of relationality and social transformation is critical. There are implications for the dynamics such as who is aware of what, who is shaping the message and who is being shaped, and trust and equality between members. Feminists have long challenged the ways that women in particular have been implicitly or explicitly told to appear positive and to deny or minimize pain, as well as noted the ways that withholding information can contribute to hierarchy and exclusion. While it is not necessarily best or even possible to always be completely transparent about financial realities, I would argue for care in navigating what is shared due in part to these relational ramifications. In one book, From Scarcity to Abundance, A Complete Guide to Parish Stewardship, author David M. Ponting suggests that in a congregation, the stewardship committee should not share their anxieties about meeting the church budget with the congregation. He describes a common scenario in many churches each fall when donations have been slow over the summer and then members of the church leadership worry whether the budget will be met by the end of the year. Generally, a meeting is called at which someone might suggest that the leadership should share these anxieties and not be worried alone. They suggest that the leadership he suggests that the leadership should not share their feelings with the congregation because the anxiety will be spread to all. Ponting argues that although this practice may be helpful in the short term by eliciting donations, it is destructive in the long term, sending a negative signal about stewardship and giving the message that the parish is in peril. Quote, people are made to feel as though they are part of a losing enterprise, end quote. There is much to consider in Ponting's example, I believe, from the perspective of genuine relationships, honest communication, and also the Christological identity of the church. While there are certainly perhaps benefits to remaining hopeful, I would also argue that sharing challenges, financial or otherwise, has a place. With respect to the relationship between positive messaging and the church as a winning enterprise, I would note, and arising from the cruciform nature of Jesus' life, that the church must challenge the idea that losing is always and necessarily a problem, particularly as defined by conventional standards. Therefore, while it may be prudent not to cause needless panic about finances in a congregation, there are important dynamics to consider in relation to honesty as a basis of relationality. I'll now consider economic differences within the congregation. So some might argue that contemporary stewardship practices do take economic differences within congregations and communities into account, as donations are voluntary and tithing as a percentage of one's income does respond somewhat to differences in income. However, I would argue that this is not sufficient. Even percentage-based tithing does not take into account the differing levels of sacrifice that the same percentage of income might represent for a poor person as for a rich person. Further, levels of wealth are connected to various factors of social location, including gender. Many authors who write about stewardship seem to believe that people are generally not giving as much as they could, so these authors tend to err on the side of emphasizing a more sacrificial gift. However, I believe we must remember how certain people, especially women, have been systematically encouraged to make sacrifices, even to the point of self-negation. Also, emphasizing sacrificial giving denies the embodied realities that many people do face financially, particularly socially marginalized people such as women, and the challenges of living in a context that not only prizes but often necessitates individual self-sufficiency. Stewardship literature tends to be quite dismissive of people's hesitancy to give more generously or to see themselves as financially vulnerable. However, I believe that remembering that embodiment matters, including the ability to provide for one's physical needs and often, particularly for women, those of one's family or community, might lead to some caution when just considering levels of giving or tithing. While addressing all congregation members with the same message in stewardship campaigns, emphasizing the need to give, and even writing books for generic congregations is common, I believe these practices need to be examined through the lens of the diverse bodies that make up congregations, in addition to the economic differences between congregations. The drive to be successful in fundraising often causes the realities of the poorest and the most marginalized to be forgotten, or worse, creates campaigns that pressure the poorest to give beyond their means. In another book entitled Rich Church, Poor Church, author J. Cliff Christopher uses rich churches and poor churches as metaphors to describe two financial approaches that actually do not relate to economic circumstances. All economic context aside, he suggests that any church can become a rich church by following his recommendations and shifting their approach to stewardship. He states that since Jesus has been raised from the dead and we are a part of the living body of Christ, that there is, quote, no excuse to be poor anymore. This denial of the embodied reality of poverty is itself highly problematic, in addition to the lack of attention he, like many others, pays to the real financial differences within and between many churches. Christopher seems satisfied that all members giving the same percentage of their income demonstrate sufficient attention to economic differences. Yet he still clearly demonstrates greater regard for larger gifts and those who are able to give them. Christopher argues for churches having clear, high expectations for giving, having, in fact, perhaps special church retreats to acknowledge major donors, and having most of the members of the finance or stewardship committee be top givers. Each of these practices could be considered at length, but generally they each demonstrate a lack of both sensitivity toward and understanding of economic inequality. They conform to mainstream secular fundraising practices of prizing larger gifts than those who give them, devaluing those who give less regardless of the personal reasons or systemic factors, instead of following in Jesus' incarnated example of lifting up the poor and their gifts and challenging systemic structures of wealth inequality. Christopher states that he is merely suggesting that those who have the gift of financial generosity be put in corresponding positions of leadership, as would be done for those with gifts in other aspects of ministry, and that churches commonly celebrate people's ministry offerings in other areas of church life, for example, volunteer recognition for people who share their time. However, I would argue that this is a false and dangerous parallel. Differences in wealth are not the same as differences in spiritual gifts, and we must be very careful that our congregational practices do not align with those of capitalism or empire, such that we create exclusive spaces to which poor congregation members do not have access, which too often include many people of color, women, children, and others who are systemically marginalized by economic structures. Rather, we must ask how congregational practices around giving and celebrating gifts align with and support social transformation within the congregation and more broadly. Finally, many authors writing about stewardship focus on the concepts of scarcity and abundance, arguing that churches and individuals need to have an attitude of abundance rather than one of scarcity. They argue that abundance is hopeful and encourages generosity, while scarcity encourages us to be fearful and protect what we have. Regardless of whether this is accurate, this becomes problematic when scarcity is treated merely as a mindset to be overcome, rather than a real lived reality and a legitimate fear for most people living in an individual society with minimal social safety nets. The principle of radicality and social transformation could help address this problem by taking scarcity seriously and concretely working to create practical incarnations of abundance for all. In another book, Money and Faith, The Search for Enough, the themes of scarcity and abundance are a key focus. Author Michael Shute explores the entire Bible as a narrative that fluctuates between scarcity and abundance, and argues that both liberal and conservative Christians struggle to believe in God's abundance against the world's message of scarcity. He argues quite simply that if we choose the God of abundance, we must reject the gods of scarcity, suggesting that the pathway from scarcity to abundance is a personal decision and a shift in mindset based on trust in God. Shute critiques the messages of the world that tell us we must support ourselves because no one will help us otherwise. This perspective rejects the possibility of abundance and gifts because in this worldview there is no giver or God. However, I would argue that we are not simply called to trust in God as the source of abundance, especially in a way that denies all evidence to the contrary, and that we must directly engage the factors that create individuals to have to support themselves or face scarcity. I believe this is connected to the incarnation, and that we are not simply called to trust a God that is immaterial, distant, and who will magically provide for our needs. Rather, I believe we are to look for incarnations of God's abundance in the world and work to enrich and extend these manifestations through social transformation. I believe one way to approach stewardship in this manner would be for Christian communities to pledge to support the material needs of their members, to create communities where people need not fear real scarcity so strongly because they have promised to manifest and incarnate God's abundance for and with one another. This is, of course, a very challenging project, and I can't get into it at length, and it may well, in fact, lead to risk and disappointment, even conflict. However, although this project might not be achieved anywhere near total perfection, it could take many smaller forms, particularly to begin with, including members providing goods and services for one another through bartering, gifts, interest-free loans, fundraising for specific needs, and the church itself perhaps creating opportunities for business or other forms of financial support. While churches certainly do some of this work, it tends to be oriented more towards people who are in acute need and not those who are congregation members quite often, creating a divide between us and them, or those who help and those who are helped. I believe, however, it is important to create a much more significant social safety net than often exists within congregations. In some cases, I believe women's ministries and informal work in churches can provide excellent examples of such initiatives. Creating or strengthening congregational safety nets could serve as a foretaste of the broader societal relationships that I believe we must actively work to create for all people through strengthening and reforming the secular social safety net. I believe that if we want people to be generous with their resources and not fear scarcity as they approach Christian stewardship, we must create the conditions where scarcity is much less prevalent and abundance is not only preached but is incarnated. To conclude, stewardship is an important topic to consider in relation to social transformation, as wealth inequality is an issue that impacts all other struggles for equality and justice, including those based on gender, race, ethnicity, disability, and so forth. In reading literature about stewardship, it is clear that much more must be done to strengthen the connection between Christian theology and ethics and practices of many congregations. Many churches would claim to support the issues that I have analyzed today, and would state that we should not only have to be positive about circumstances that are challenging, they would say in many cases that it is important to attend to economic diversity, and that scarcity and abundance is more complex than simply a mindset. Yet I would argue that if church practices demonstrate otherwise as they engage in stewardship, there are serious ramifications. In considering justice issues, many churches may focus more on their beliefs and statements, but I think the incarnation reminds us that practices, including stewardship, preach. Stewardship can and must preach incarnation and social transformation, ways of countercultural living and relating to money for the sakes of individuals, churches, and the world at large. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I bring you greetings from the Great Lakes state of Michigan, where we are unsalted and shark-free. I decided to exhort public theology because I've been profoundly moved by the courage and agency of my parishioners who are in the struggle, en la lucha, as said by Maria Isasi Diaz, to stop deportations and to dehumanize the American immigrations, to humanize the immigration system in the United States. My overarching thesis explores how progressive Christians are protected by the U.S. Constitution to craft just policy to effectuate positive social change for those on the margins. This emerging field of public theology must be a major focus of 21st century Christianity. The presentation highlights the importance of the gospel narrative for public theology to alleviate suffering, and in this instance, from a Latina perspective. It features an exegesis of the persistent widow and the unjust judge found in Luke 18, and then it is juxtaposed with a real-life event at a deportation protest in Detroit, Michigan. So I'm just going to show these slides and you can read them on your own. I'm not going to comment on them as we go, but I thought it'd be a pretty good idea to have a definition of public theology. I'm a lawyer, we have to define everything. The presentation today highlights the importance of understanding what our rights are under the First Amendment. Okay. All right. This is a photo of a demonstration we did through a community organizing entity to stop a deportation. And we are standing on the grounds of the City County building in Detroit. Okay, that's what our First Amendment says. It gives us 4 rights of speech, four specific rights: speech, the freedom to exercise our religion, the right of the press, and the peaceable assembly of the people to petition our grievances against the government. There's one prohibition to Congress, and that is to establish a supreme religion. How have we done so far? So, in conjunction with the First Amendment, we have some regulations in our tax code that prohibit nonprofit entities from doing certain things. And a lot of people think that a 501c3 status preempts a church's advocacy or a church member's advocacy, and that's simply not true. When I guest preach and call for participation at sister Episcopal parishes in our diocese, very often at the coffee hour somebody says to me, "Oh, we can't do that because we would lose our 501c3 tax exemption." Not true. Nonprofits are precluded from advocating for or against a particular candidate and from trying to influence a ballot measure either way. So they're election related primarily. This is a press conference, and I'm standing there, and there are all the people on the front line are clerics of various stripes. At the far end, you can see there's also an imam. And we made a public statement about what our deportation practices are doing to people's lives. The framework of my dissertation falls in 3 sections, if you will. I'm using the Stephen Bevan's Praxis mode of contextual theology. So there will be a lot of seeing, looking for, and understanding what injustice is out there. And of course, prayer is woven all the way through it. And I loved what you said about the importance of spirituality not being just a component, but threaded through. Thinking about our history, about what our case law says, about what's going on presently that's being informed by a bad past, like slavery and indentured servitude. And recognizing that all faith traditions are covered. Ooh. There's an expletive in there, and I apologize, but it's protected speech. Because he is saying, this was during the controversy about taking down Civil War statues. He was not in favor. That word is protected. Specifically, that word was featured in a Supreme Court case. So understanding that there are ways for us to be advocates, we're going to turn to an exegesis of the persistent widow. Jesus then told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused. But later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" Jesus' ministry advances social justice through his clear-eyed and scorching critique of Roman-occupied Israel, because the Hebrew Testament requires respect for the care and care for the widow, orphan, stranger, and the poor. Those requirements were being whole-scale ignored. Pharaoh's historic hard-heartedness finds its way into the hearts of first-century Palestine leaders, both Roman and Jewish. The cry of the people is loud and clear. Jesus exhorts the people to cry out to God, who hears the people. The unjust judge acts as if the widow is without legal standing and consequently no recourse. Thus his actions aim to erase the widow from society. Society extends her no standing without the imprimatur of her father, husband, or son, and the widow of this parable serves as an amalgam for those protected classes of the orphan, stranger, the poor. She correctly relies on biblical precedent, and further, the patriarchal societies of both Rome and Israel treat her as ignorant of her rights and expect her subordination. Jesus extols the widow's virtue as he tells her story by highlighting how she always prays and keeps demanding justice. Jesus uses the parable as a teaching tool to underscore the importance for the people to pray persistently. And in Greek, that's pantote proseukestai. I was so excited when I saw that word prokeusestai, because we get prosecute from that. I can't tell you how excited I am. As a matter of fact, when in a complaint, at the end, when the relief is requested, it is called the prayer for relief. The Greek term Hypokrites, or hypo is underhanded, or use of the hand, or underneath. So he's underhanded. And surprisingly, he knows he could be damaged by this weak person, this weak widow. And so his motive is not about honor. He fears she will sock him in the eye, literally or figuratively maybe. Without compunction, the judge breaches his ethical duty. He merely wears a mask of fairness to cover a face of treachery. And the widow, though she appears to be the inferior party here in this spar, uses the precedent of Torah to champion righteousness. The two of them are engaged in what Melina and Rohrbach call challenge riposte, where usually equals are having some sort of a conversation with each other. And typically, if you're the superior, you don't pick on an inferior. Culturally, that would have been considered bullying. And if you're the inferior taking on the superior, you are being uppity and you don't know your place. And so it is with great courage that she takes on the judge. The action is jarring and disjunctive for both of them, but ultimately for her, it works. And we can read the parable through 21st century Latina eyes, through Palma, who has essentially been made a widow by the immigration system because her husband had been interned at a detention center for over 1 year without procedural process. She appeared at a deportation demonstration at the Detroit-based headquarters for our ICE office, ironically named for American civil rights leader Rosa Parks. She stepped to the microphone to speak her truth haltingly as she looked down in her notes. Her big tears fall and form little rivers smearing off the page. She prays for mercy and justice. Thank you all for being here to support my husband, Miguel. He has been detained for over a year now, and if he is deported, his life is in danger. He is my loving husband, and I miss him so much. I was pregnant, and I lost our baby due to the stress. But I know that when God reunites us, we will have children and a bright, happy family. I asked the ICE Regional Director, Rebecca Aducci, to exercise her prosecutorial discretion by releasing my husband. Please pray for us and all of those who suffer over deportation. Thank you. Palma climbs out of the land of exile and crosses the border of white privilege to challenge racial discrimination in public. She exercises her prophetic imagination and speaks truth to power through her profound faith. And I know when God reunites us. The Congress operates in the very same way as the unjust judge by seeking to erase both the aggregate Latino contributions to society as well as erasing the personhood. Though emotionally and spiritually naked, Palma's tiny frame grows larger than life as she echoes the Israelite cry of oppression across so many human centuries. She defies a socioeconomic assumption that she would allow herself to be silenced, and she stares down Congress and its citizens, including me. Palma makes this demand for justice according to Torah by adoption through Abraham and Sarah, Marian and Jesus. She throws down the challenge to preserve Miguel's honor as well as her own. She draws strength from God and makes bold statements of faith and requests intercessory prayers from the community, the place of transformation. She speaks her truth about how wrathful law criminalizes unjustly and consequently debases human beings. As I stood by her, she breathed new life into that parable of the persistent widow and the unjust judge. and brought it into her reality and into ours. She offered 3 important actions that draw attention to the trauma of her husband's detention and impending deportation. She demonstrates how actions like these result in further faith formation, not just for herself, but for the witnesses. First, Palma critiques the American ideology that would have her and people of color contribute to the point of physical and psychological depletion until the privileged class discards or disappears them via deportation as is most convenient. A hypocrisy of catastrophic proportions. Second, she gives her pain and vulnerability as an oblation, publicly and stalwartly. In the words of Walter Brueggemann, all the way from the cry in Egypt to a theology of the cross, this tradition has affirmed that fresh and mature faith has been strangely given this disjunction, which is so costly. Transformation, like Palma calls for, does not happen in a state of peace and equilibrium, but rather in the fracture of space and time when injustice is fully acknowledged and restoration to shalom occurs. And finally, Palma prophesizes for the future in a practice of social imagination authored and energized by the public processing of pain as an act of dangerous subversion, but also as an act of concrete hope. Palma stands with allies against the empire. She intervenes for the lowly ones and calls for a new future based on her faith. She describes and bids for the coming of the reign of God on earth. She knew her story would fall on deaf ears that day, as it had for the persistent widow many times. Yet she saw injustice, she reflected, she acted, she prayed, and she publicly demanded justice. As described, Palma engaged in a liberative praxis to wrest herself and her community from this oppressive system. Praxis is not something that she just went out and did. Rather, praxis is a part of her life. It is about living out her conscience. Like the widow, she relied on faith to reorder her reality dynamically. Palma is a public theologian. Miguel was deported a few weeks later. The faithful on earth continue unceasingly in the prayers and challenges to injustice in the struggle and la lucha. Thank you.
Wow, yeah.
We already have a very powerful, moving presentations that is not about reality, out there, but reality within us. And there's a lot of interesting things, and I hope hear some of thoughts and questions from you. We are going to open our question Q&A session. Any thoughts, any questions for our 3 amazing presenters today?
Oh, Sheryl, actually.
Yes.
So, Dr. Billimore is not here, but he wrote a
Nice
paper.
and loud for the...
Dr. Billimore is not here, but he wrote a paper contrasting Western ethics and Indian ethics, and the tendency of the West to sort of look at certain norms and then freeze them and then to try to use those norms over a period of time. And the sense that I was getting when you're looking at these various churches is that they are not exactly situated in a particular church, so it's not really context driven because each church could have so many other factors that affect stewardship. So I was just thinking that ethics should be more constructive in the sense that the context would determine. For example, in America, to not have 2 cars is probably being poor, because that's relative poverty. And in India, if you don't have a pair of shoes, you're poor. So context would determine how much you would tithe, the relationship of stewardship. So I was just wondering, how would you bring that in terms of stewardship and honesty and constructing value for like a bunch of churches? Yeah, that was just a thought that came across.
Okay, thank you, Rafina.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. I'd love to read that paper. Thank you for raising that. Yeah, and I think that maybe part of the issue is looking at stewardship literature. I think that often, on a more local level, there probably is more attention, and in some cases to different nuances, but perhaps trying to write for a general audience, that means that there are a lot of issues kind of arise from that particular avenue that I've focused in on my analysis. But I think you're totally right. I think that is another major issue, is the need to look at context and the need to think about the economic differences that exist in different parts of the world and within and between congregations, and I think also raising the ethical norms as well, I think is a really important point to raise, and I'd love to think more about that and how particularly Western ethical approaches maybe have some limitations when considering an issue like this. So I appreciate that very much.
Okay, now we have a lot. Okay, 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. Okay.
This question is for Keyona. You made a profound point about from an eco-womanist standpoint, the kinds of negative ramifications impacting rural communities, yet we hear that these prison industrial complexes are bringing so much economic benefit to rural communities around jobs and other things. Can you talk about some ways that we might help educate rural communities with a counter-narrative so that they begin to also possibly resist the inroads of these complexes?
Yes. Author Michelle Alexander stated that in order to change the mindset around mass incarceration, we had to help change public consciousness around incarceration, period, right? And so America being a capitalist society, business is just seen as business, right? And there's a body is a commodity, right? It's worth something. So I think that if we go into these communities, get to know what's going on, their economic, where do they place one economic value, and how do they value life, right? We can begin a conversation that says, okay, I know this prison that is coming here is feeding your whole family and has been for generations. And what else could we do in this environment to bring in a different economy where these people are not housed? So I think it begins with a conversation with the people within that community, right? Because I can't come and tell them, of course I can come and say, well, this is wrong, and give them 1 to 5 reasons of why this is wrong, right? But in their mindset, it is right because it's providing, 1, it's housing the criminals, right? 2, and it's providing food and housing for their families. So I think it starts with the conversation within those communities.
Okay. Next question, Jim.
Thanks so much for these papers. I appreciate the perspectives that y'all are bringing, and I'm particularly appreciating the challenge to white supremacy that I was hearing Keyona voice, as well as Sheryl's sense of Copeland's work in terms of the specificity of our bodies. And I'm wondering, in light of those 2 comments, if each of you could talk a little bit about the impact that your social location has on the way that you interpret the text and the resources that you interpret it, over the course of today. Like I'm curious about kind of the vocation of the theologian and how we can responsibly interpret these situations in a way that challenges or engages privilege, really.
Sure, yeah, so I mean, certainly, yeah, social location definitely, I think, impacts how I've come to this study, why I've chosen this topic. I think that the possibilities, so as a person with significant privilege, I think about how stewardship could be an avenue for social transformation and for redistribution of wealth. So I think particularly for people with privilege, I see much more radical potential for stewardship than is currently operational. So I think that that's why I feel a particular call to this work and to transforming how it's approached. So yeah, I could say more, but I think that that's my first initial thought about that.
As for myself, in my day job, I work with justice-involved population, and I have family members that have been involved in the justice-involved system my entire life. And I vowed as a child that I saw them go in and out of jail and come out like back and forth, and I vowed as a child that I was going to be a part of a program or a space to provide a resource to, one, halt that, to halt recidivism. And then in bringing in eco-womanism, as an ordained interfaith minister, I wanted to be able to bring my whole self to the work that I'm doing. And it was actually, this paper was born out of a project in my eco-womanism, my womanism in earth arts class, earth justice class. And so Dr. Bittencourt, she challenged me to bridge both my work that I was doing in the academy, my day job, and my spirituality, and thus, this paper was born. And then in the thesis project that I had under the leadership of Dr. J. Johnson, I studied, they allowed me to go to Europe 2 summers ago and to study justice-involved populations there, specifically faith voice organizations that work with women. And I was allowed to come back and do a compare and contrast study with faith-based organizations in the Bay Area and the work that they did with women. And out of that came forth a gender-specific program in answer to carceral anti-ecology as a whole. Right? So I believe that this work, I'm able to bring my whole self to it.
Thank you. Yeah, I will start. Thank you, all three. I was struck, especially with the first 2 papers, but I think it is applicable to the third as well, how our kind of underlying economic capitalist system roots, I think all 3 of these issues that you're addressing, and specifically in terms of congregations, the extent to which our congregations, especially I think in the Protestant world in America, maybe not so much in Canada, I'm not sure, have adopted, the profit-based model. You noted that a little bit. And then, Keyona, in your paper, just, thinking of the roots of the intertwining of capitalism and racism, and specifically, the United States is being built on slavery, and the connection that you made between slavery and racism and Michelle Alexander's work. I wonder if you considered sort of strategies, sort of alternative models, because I think it is rooted in this problem of economics. And the economic system that we have, at least in this country, is a profit-based, you have to make more money, you have to bring in more inmates so you can make more money, right? That there's a logic that keeps working. So I'm wondering if you thought about the role of the kind of dominant model that we have, and ways in which that perhaps can be challenged in the voice of someone like Hanna. She's doing a direct kind of challenge to that whole system.
Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can go. Thank you so much for your question. And this is an amazing question that I'd love to talk to you more about, because this is basically my whole dissertation project. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that really what I was struck by, and what brought me to this work in general, was just this sense of being part of a church and a tradition that, you know, says that it wants to challenge empire, wants to challenge capitalism, but then embodies in so many ways such a capitalist ideology. So yeah, and I think that it's really interesting to think also, I think in particular, maybe in my own context, the role that decline is playing in this, because I think that that's really leading people to say, you know, in the best circumstances, we wouldn't want to have to do this, but you know, these are exceptional times, and the church might disappear. So therefore, some of these practices, even that they might have some criticism of, I think then be seen as justified because there's this sense that the, you know, the end justifies the means, so to speak. So that's maybe one aspect of that that I would note. And so, yeah, I think that there, in terms of, you know, alternative proposals, I think that, yeah, it's a good question. I think there are some good examples out there, and I do want to also lift up those examples. For instance, you know, I think that there are some maybe emergent church communities that have done some neat things around you know, paying off student loans of members, or providing alternative loans so that people don't have to take out conventional mortgages or other, you know, get into that, in the whole debt industry to begin with. You know, in terms of, you know, practicing more, you know, thinking about, you know, communal living, these other alternatives that can be a way to maybe not dismantle the economy as it is, but create alternatives that maybe can be a source of belief that alternatives are possible by living them out on a small scale. So, and I think too, I mean, particularly my work with some religious orders, and as they close, and seeing the really amazing examples of what they've done with their property and what they've done with their finances, I think has been quite also another example, I think, of maybe being able to not see closing or death or ending as a failure as the conventional economic model would see. So those would be maybe a few positive examples I would lift out as alternatives.
Well, I think for myself, because capitalism is so pervaded and ingrained in our society, we have to look at a new way of living and being as a whole. And I think just for those who commit crimes, right, by laws that were created, I think if we begin with restorative healing and restorative practices just on a communal level, right, I think I would start there. I know in South Africa there's this saying, Ubuntu, I am, so therefore you are. So if someone commits harm to someone or something in the community, they are surrounded in a circle and say, not why did you do that, they will ask the question, what happened to you, right? Because something had to happen to you first in order for you to make, they believe that something had to happen to you first in order to make that choice. And when we have people that are committing crimes because they're poor, right? That's a totally, we can add that to the conversation, right? Of let's address impoverished, not poverty, impoverished people, right? And that becomes a larger conversation. I think we need to get rid of the system as a whole, right? So in terms of alternatives, let's just dismantle it.
When I was practicing law, we had a statute that would create a situation where a young person who had possession of a small amount of cocaine, usually, would get lifetime probation. Now, anything would violate probation, like a speeding ticket or whatever. So I don't know about y'all, but there's no way that I could promise that. And so it was just a revolving door. It just never seemed to stop. And I got very, very frustrated. And we're complicit in it, you know. But really the way to change it is through the legislature. You can't do it through an individual case. But you see the effects of poverty in that example, because not only is there poverty, there's lack of opportunity, and there's a lack of hope. And so you're a kid, and you wind up doing what you see your buddies doing. And it became so frustrating that I stopped that area of practice.
Was that in Michigan, or is that still the law?
I don't know, because it's been so long. I think it is.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have another thoughts or questions?
I did have a couple. One of the things I thought about as you were speaking about incarceration, especially in rural areas, I thought about three things. One, the fact that guards routinely die in Texas prisons, not because they've been harmed by the prisoners, but because there's no air conditioning for the prisoners and they're on the block and they're overweight and encumbered and stressed and they simply die. And I would suggest that there's more of that going on around the country in rural areas where the guards are treated any better, basically, than the prisoners. The next thing I thought about as you were speaking is what happened in one particular hill country prison where the prisoners and the guards were at odds about music all the time because the prisoners were listening to hip hop and the guards wanted to listen to hill country music, and those two things we presume to be at odds with each other until someone who was enlightened brought them together, and they started combining hip hop with hill music, and it has become a whole genre of music called hip hop. But the more important, the more important part of that was the was a result of this combining, where the guards started talking about being, quote, their terms not mine, poor white trash, and seeing again the relationship that we've tried to show over many, many, many years, probably over 200 years, of the conditions that affect poor white people and people of color. So that might be something, if you're acting on those steps that you were talking about, that might be something to consider. I was thinking about your idea about successful drives for money in churches, and I wondered what the impact of changing the idea of the church itself from a monument to a movement might do to that effort. And I thought about Acts 4, 32 to 37. I don't usually talk about biblical verses per se, but I just preached on it. So that was the lectionary for this week. Acts 32 to 37, and it talked about how wonderful it was. People were bringing in their tithes and sharing with the apostles, and everybody was selling everything they had and bringing it in. Well, the next chapter is quite different. It talked about Ananias and Sapphira, who held back some of their money, and people there were polarities of discussions about that, which was the right position. Were they liars and cheaters because they kept some money away from the church and presumably from God? Or were the people who were gathering in all the resources acting in a communistic way? Those were the two polarities of responses about these two chapters. And I wondered, what were the hidden needs of Ananias and Sapphira that they couldn't share with their congregation and say, look, we're scared, we need whatever. So I'm wondering about when you were talking about honesty, I'm wondering if you were talking about that level of honesty where the people actually talk about their needs so that we don't get this vague thing about economic diversity. What does that mean? I'm not exactly sure that I want economic diversity. I don't think I want poor people to make things look even somehow. I'd rather fix their economic concerns. The third thing I was thinking of, Reverend Ledford, was how often you bump into these phrases in religion that match what we say in court. Prayer for relief is still the last thing we write when we write a brief. And I was also wondering, where is Palma? Where does she fit in your next steps? What will she do?
She's still in the tray. then they're separate, because he can't come back.
But you called her a public theologian.
Yes.
Are you still in conversation with her about how that can manifest itself?
I haven't been recently because I've been busy with this work, but that's definitely something that I want to do. She's involved in the same community organizing group that organized the press conference. And
so your work is distinguishable from hers?
Yes, but my point is that by speaking publicly about her faith, she's exercising her First Amendment right of free exercise. And we are all theologians. We all have been taught in our tradition some sort of a litmus test, when we know something is right and when it's not. And she was exercising that day. And so when I say she's a public theologian, that's what I'm talking about. Is she doing it on a regular basis? No. And I know for sure that she is not feeling as motivated to talk about it since he's been deported.
Yeah.
It was defeating, and she's trying to figure out what to do with her life while he's away. Is she going to join him? Is she going to stay here? Her citizenship is established here. She, I think, would much prefer to stay here. So it's a real problem. It's a conundrum. And you're automatically banned for 10 years when you get deported.
Oh, wow.
So he cannot come back for 10 years.
Yeah, for 10 years.
She can go
The
there.
deportee cannot come back.
Wow.
If you entered illegally and have been deported.
Turkey was ascending the bonds that people pay to get out of jail. Before they've even had their trial, they're in jail 6 months or a year.
Yep.
And
Now, typically in that situation, you get time served. So whatever your ultimate sentence is, that time is credited. Not in this situation. He just basically sat in jail for over a year.
Okay. Yeah, well, first, or do you want me to go where? Okay, sure. Yeah, so thank you, also for your comments and questions. I totally agree that the question of, is the church a monument or a movement, I think is very critical to consider. I think in the current, model, there's this, at least in, mainline kind of Protestantism, if you can afford it, you can have it, and you don't have to question it, in terms of thinking about buildings, in terms of thinking about staff, in terms of thinking about, a vast array of things. So I think that a key part, too, is thinking about, do we need buildings? Do we need the things that we're spending money on? And I think that's something to be considered. At the same time, I think that, in certain cases and in certain communities, I think church buildings can serve a critical role and fill a gap in terms of, non-commercial public space that is needed. So I think that you don't necessarily need to be totally get rid of all the property right away. I think that there's maybe a little bit more nuance to that. In terms of honesty, I appreciate that you raised that, and I think that in some church communities, I've seen people share a great deal of information about health needs with one another, and I do wish that that we could share. I think, as you suggested, more about the economic needs we might have and work to alleviate those. And I totally agree that attending to economic diversity maybe seems like, very much still working within the system, and I think that I always see that as the very first step to, eliminating the economic diversity in the world ultimately, but I think that if we don't talk about the differences that do exist, I think that then we're kind of operating on this myth that everyone is in the same, more or less the same circumstance, so I totally agree, and I think that, yes, this project itself is maybe just the very first step in wider social transformation that I would want to see. So thank you for bringing that point up.
Could you repeat the question?
no, I can't.
Oh,
I was there were 3 observations that I had because of.
Yes, so the point that you made as to the guards and how they're now identified or come to accept that they're considered to be poor white class, so in addressing this, just dismantling the prison industry complex itself and how it relates to them in terms of classism, I think will be something that I can definitely add into.
Okay, we still have like 5 more minutes for
The gentleman over there.
One.
We still have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, can everyone make like one brief question?
Yeah, instead of long, because we have.
Okay, go ahead. Seth, right?
Yeah, has there been, or have you looked at research that is done on youth detention centers or youth rehabilitation centers and the effectiveness therein as well as the profitability?
In terms of the prison industry complex?
Right, like to do a comparative in terms of, so youth is a sexy topic, people want to invest in that, people want to spend money on that in terms of nonprofits or in terms of profits. Would it be more seductive to a rural community, say, to be building a facility that rehabilitates and humanizes people based on research that would be done using the youth facilities that are used to therapeutically rehabilitate and help? Or is the system just so frickin' broken that it won't matter because, as was pointed out, the laws are set up just to send people right back in regardless of what good gets done while they're being detained?
I think that we can adopt some of the models that are used in Denmark, in Amsterdam, in Portugal, where they're closing down prisons because they have decriminalized substance abuse and mental health challenges. So I think we can start there. As well as in London, they have what's called custodial alternatives. So if you can commit a nonviolent crime, that you would just be supervised, right? And you have to seek rehabilitation. So if you have been identified as having a substance abuse challenge, you have to go to treatment. If you have been identified as having a mental health experience, you have to, seek treatment. So I think if we just start, if we can pass a law that decriminalize mental health as well as substance abuse challenges, the prison rules, you know what I mean? It will go away significantly. Yeah. But in terms of youth, most of the youth that are housed in juvenile justice detention facilities, they are from the foster care system. So that brings in another issue in terms of what's going on with the foster care system and how they've been abandoned and neglected and basically left out into the streets to die. So I think that would be definitely an important topic to bring up.
Nobody's paying attention to them until they become a problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Marcia? I just had a brief suggestion for you. Thank you for sharing that story and your concept of see, think, and act, and you're building on that. I'm wondering if this public theology has had any success stories in its agency, or
Yes, there have been many. There's also a lot that don't work, but I just have to remind myself the arc of history, while long, bends towards justice. And if we just go quiet, it's certainly not going to change. And of course, all the things that I said about the First Amendment, and I quit the PowerPoint because it was distracting me. But one of the things that I wanted to underscore is that the First Amendment rights of speech and so forth apply to all of the traditions. And so while the text, the sacred text, is different, it's, the public advocacy is available to Muslims in Detroit, and we have the largest population of Arabs and Muslims in the Detroit metro area outside of the Middle East. And so interfaith conversation is very, very important. We have a very large, politically active Jewish community as well. And there have been actions through this community organizing entity that have worked. And we do these protests a lot. We've done pilgrimages. I'm often asked to come up and, give a homily or a blessing or a holy unction and we're starting to incorporate more liturgy. And even if the decision makers aren't swayed, people are watching on the street and they drive by and they honk their horns or they go like this. And that is a success. It's a small one, but it's starting to affect the public opinion. You know, when people see us out there, you know, you're going to get engaged when you see something like this. You're going to get engaged, even if it's just for a fleeting moment, and it's going to make you think. So yes, some are measurable, some aren't. And there's more than just immigration advocacy. I picked that because that's what I've been so profoundly moved by.
Okay, one over here, one hand raised. Over here. Okay.
Hi, this is a question for Keyona and possibly Marcia or Sheryl, anyone, because I think they're kind of tied together. So starting with Keyona, I was really impressed with your bringing in the movements with black, brown, and I'm going to say red bodies, Native American spirituality, that honors the dignity, the spirituality of women, the earth, animals, etc. And I'm just wondering if you know of is there a movement in the red and black and brown communities to build bridges together to learn from their cultures and from their works in both imprisonment issues and ecological issues? And I'm going to ground it in the fact that last year there was a conference in, I believe it's Washington, D.C. or in New York, of black spiritual leaders that were talking about the prison movement and what needs to be done, because that is where primarily a lot of the population is ending up in. So they're coming up with spiritual and legal ideas to join together those two careers to address the issue. And then one of the men stood up and said that the black community needs to join with the people in Standing Rock, because the issues between imprisonment and the government's takeover of tribal lands are bringing in a lot of red people that are being imprisoned in the prisons for trying to defend their lands. And the people in Standing Rock are actually youth. That was a youth movement that actually started Standing Rock. And by them honoring their spiritual tribal practices, the honor for the women, the animals, the land, the water, were very important to the black communities as well, and that these two communities would benefit from joining together so that you would have theologians, lawyers, environmentalists, led by women and children, to find new ways of addressing how we can actually bring more than just capitalism into churches, but bring in the spirit of people honoring the living beings around us from a different cultural perspective from red, black, and brown bodies, to actually speak to the white bodies who have seemed to forgotten these things. So when Marcia, you were talking about the woman who was trying to defend her husband, by bringing in a spiritual context and speaking truth to power, what I got from that was marginalized pleas of people. There's what we learned from those kinds of people speaking to the authorities is they're bringing in a spirituality of marginalized courage to speak truth to power. I think that kind of an idea is actually bringing more into the church, as we see it, than money, because it speaks to a community of people that maybe don't have money, but what can they contribute to both the church and our communities to find faith and hope to carry and learn from each other. So going back to Keyona, do you know if there is a movement between black and brown and red communities, if there's a leadership that's coming together to build those bridges to find that?
Thank you.
Or more on a grassroots level, I know that communities that are coming together that honor their indigenous traditions of their people. And in terms of when it comes to prisons, you realize that we have the federal prisons and the state prisons, and then we have on the land of indigenous people here that are native to this land, they have their own justice system. And so I haven't even begun to touch on the conversation of the police killings on their land, right, by our police officers, and how next to women being the fastest growing population in carceral institutions, so are brown people, right, in terms, excuse me, not brown, indigenous people of this land, as well as
people who are considered to be immigrants, right? So there's several different issues that are going on at the same time, but yes, there are some grassroots organizations where we are in conversation with each other to begin to address this challenge.
Want to add something?
No. Okay, so we over 5 minutes, I believe, but this is a very interesting conversation, and I really appreciate our 3 presenters for today because they speak from their own experience, and this is not a paper, but it's what they have been doing in the community. So it's their praxis, and so let us give a very
Yeah, and thanks to Ika for your facilitation. We have some lunch out, there's sandwiches and drinks. I think I ordered vegetarian sandwiches, and as a vegetarian, I'm very sad to have not necessarily spotted them yet, but hopefully they're there. And we'll get started again at 1:15.